Knecht cheerfully returned his look. "You must not have such misgivings, Domine, or I should have to remind you of various admonishments you felt called upon to give me at the time, when I, as the youngest Magister, took the duties of my office too seriously. At one such moment you told me, I have just remembered this, that if I, the Magister Ludi, were a scoundrel or an incompetent, and did everything a Magister is forbidden to do, in fact, if I deliberately set out to use my high position to do as much harm as possible, all this would no more disturb our dear Castalia, or affect it any more profoundly than a pebble that is thrown into a lake. A few ripples and circles, and all trace is gone. That is how firm, how secure our Castalian order is, how inviolable its spirit, you said. Do you recall? No, you are certainly not to blame for any efforts of mine to be as bad a Castalian as possible, and to do the greatest possible harm to the order. Moreover, you also know that what I do cannot shake your own tranquillity. But I want to go on with my story. The fact that I could make such a decision at the very beginning of my magistracy, and that I did not forget it, but am now about to carry it out, that fact is related to a kind of spiritual experience I have from time to time, which I call awakening. But you already know about that. I once spoke to you about it, when you were my mentor and guru. In fact, I complained to you at the time that since my accession to office, that experience had not come to me, and seemed to be vanishing more and more into the distance. "I remember," the President agreed. "I was somewhat taken aback at the time by your capacity for this kind of experience. It is rather rare among us, whereas in the world outside it occurs in so many varied forms, sometimes in the genius, especially in statesmen and generals, but also in feeble, semi-pathological, and on the whole rather meagerly gifted persons such as clairvoyants, telepaths, and mediums. You seem to me to have no kinship at all with these two types, the aggressive heroes or the clairvoyants and diviners. Rather, you seem to me then, and until yesterday, to be a good Castalian, prudent, clear-headed, obedient. I thought it completely out of the question that you should ever be the victim of mysterious voices, whether of divine or diabolic origin, or even voices from within your own self. Therefore, I interpreted the states of awakening which you described to me simply as your becoming aware occasionally of personal growth. Given that interpretation, it followed that these spiritual insights would not be coming your way for a considerable time. After all, you had just entered office, and had assumed a task which still hung loosely around you like an overcoat too big for you. You would still have to grow into it. But tell me this. Have you ever believed that these awakenings are anything like revelations from higher powers, communications or summons from the realm of an objective, eternal, or divine truth? In saying this, Knecht replied, you bring me to my present difficulty, to express in words something that refuses to be put into words, to make rational what is obviously extra-rational. No, I never thought of those awakenings as manifestations of a god or daemon or some absolute truth. What gives these experiences their weight and persuasiveness is not their truth, their sublime origin, their divinity, or anything of the sort, but their reality. They are tremendously real, somewhat the way a violent physical pain or a surprising natural event, a storm or earthquake, seem to us charged with an entirely different sort of reality, presence, inexorability from ordinary times and conditions. The gust of wind that precedes a thunderstorm, sending us into the house and almost wrenching the front door away from our hand, or a bad toothache which seems to concentrate all the tensions, sufferings, and conflicts of the world in our jaw. These are such realities. Later on we may start to question them, or examine their significance, if that is our bent. But at the moment they happen, they admit no doubts and are brimful of reality. My awakening has a similar kind of intensified reality for me. That is why I have given it this name. At such times I really feel as if I had lain asleep, or half asleep for a long time, but am now awake and clear-headed and receptive in a way I never am ordinarily. In history, too, moments of tribulation or great upheavals have their element of convincing necessity. They create a sense of irresistible immediacy and tension. Whatever the consequence of such upheavals, be it beauty and clarity or savagery and darkness, whatever happens will bear the semblance of grandeur, necessity, and importance, and will stand out as utterly different from everyday events. He paused to catch his breath, then continued, "But let me try to examine this matter from another angle. Do you recall the legend of St. Christopher? Yes? Well, now Christopher was a man of great strength and courage, but he wanted to serve rather than to be a master and govern. Service was his strength and his art. He had a faculty for it. But whom he served was not a matter of indifference to him. He felt that he had to serve the greatest, the most powerful master. And when he heard of a mightier master, he promptly offered his services. I have always been fond of this great servant, and I must in some way resemble him. At any rate, during the one period in my life when I had command over myself, during my student years, I searched and vacillated for a long time before deciding what master to serve. For years I remained mistrustful of the glass bead game and fended it off, although I had long ago recognized it as the most precious and characteristic fruit of our province. I had tasted the bait, and knew that there was nothing more attractive and more subtle on earth than the game. I had also observed fairly early that this enchanting game demanded more than naive amateur players, that it took total possession of the man who had succumbed to its magic. And an instinct within me rebelled against my throwing all my energies and interests into this magic forever. Some naive feeling for simplicity, for wholeness and soundness, warned me against the spirit of the Valsel vicus lusorum. I sensed in it a spirit of specialism and virtuosity, certainly highly cultivated, certainly richly elaborated, but nevertheless isolated from humanity and the whole of life, a spirit that had soared too high into haughty solitariness. For years I doubted and probed, until the decision had matured within me, and in spite of everything, I decided in favor of the game. I did so because I had within me that urge to seek the supreme fulfillment and serve only the greatest master. "I understand," Master Alexander said. "But no matter how I regard it, and no matter how you try to represent it, I come up against the same reason for your singularities. You have an excessive sense of your own person, or dependence on it, which is far from the same thing as being a great personality. A man can be a star of the first magnitude in gifts, willpower, and endurance, but so well balanced that he turns with the system to which he belongs without any friction or waste of energy. Another may have the same great gifts, or even finer ones, but the axis does not pass precisely through the center, and he squanders half his strength in eccentric movements which weaken him and disturb his surroundings. You evidently belong to this type. Only I must admit that you have contrived to conceal it remarkably. For that very reason the malady seems to be breaking out now with all the greater virulence. You spoke of St. Christopher, and I must say that although there is something grand and touching about this saint, he is not a model for a servant of our hierarchy. One who wishes to serve should abide by the master he has sworn to serve for good and ill, and not with the secret reservation that he will change as soon as he finds a more magnificent master. In assuming such an attitude, the servant makes himself his master's judge, and this indeed is what you are doing. You always want to serve the highest master, and are naive enough to decide for yourself the rank of the masters among whom you make your choice." Knecht had listened attentively, although a shadow of sadness passed across his face. Now he continued, "I respect your opinion, and could not have imagined that it would be any different. But let me go on with my story just a little longer. I became Magister Ludi, and in fact was sure for a good while that I was serving the highest of all masters. At any rate, my friend Designori, our patron in the Federal Council, once described to me in extremely vivid terms what an arrogant, conceited, blasé elitist and virtuoso of the game I once was. But I must also tell you the meaning that the word transcend has had for me since my student years and my awakening. It came to me, I think, while reading a philosopher of the Enlightenment, and under the influence of Master Thomas van der Trave, and ever since then it has been a veritable magic word for me, like awakening, an impetus, a consolation, and a promise. My life, I resolved, ought to be a perpetual transcending, a progression from stage to stage. I wanted it to pass through one area after the next, leaving each behind, as music moves on from theme to theme, from tempo to tempo, playing each out to the end, completing each and leaving it behind, never tiring, never sleeping, forever wakeful, forever in the present. In connection with the experiences of awakening, I had noticed that such stages and such areas exist, and that each successive period in one's life bears within itself, as it is approaching its end, a note of fading and eagerness for death. That, in turn, leads to a shifting to a new area, to awakening and new beginnings. I am telling you about the significance to me of transcending in order to provide another clue which may help you interpret my life. The decision in favor of the glass bead game was an important stage, as was the first time I took my place in the hierarchy by accepting an assignment. I have also experienced such movements from stage to stage in my office as Magister. The best thing the office has given me was the discovery that making music and playing the glass bead game are not the only happy activities in life, that teaching and educating can be just as exhilarating. And I gradually discovered, furthermore, that teaching gave me all the more pleasure the younger and more unspoiled by miseducation the pupils were. This, too, like many other things, led me in the course of the years to desire younger and younger pupils, so that I would have liked most to have become a teacher in an elementary school. In short, at times my imagination dwelt on matters which in themselves lay outside my functions. He paused for a moment to rest. The President remarked, "You astonish me more and more, Magister. Here you are, speaking about your own life, and you mention scarcely anything but subjective experiences, personal wishes, personal developments and decisions. I really had no idea that a Castalian of your rank could see himself and his life in such a light." His voice had a note between reproach and sorrow. It pained Knecht, but he remained equable and exclaimed merrily, "Esteemed Magister, we are not speaking about Castalia, about the board and the hierarchy at the moment, but only about me, about the psychology of a man who unfortunately has been forced to cause you great inconvenience. It would be improper for me to speak of my conduct of office, the way I have met my obligations, my value or lack of it as a Castalian and Magister. My conduct of office lies open before you. You can easily look into it, as you can into the entire exterior of my life. You will not find much to censure. But what we are concerned with here is something wholly different. I am trying to show you the path I have trodden as an individual, which has led me out of Waldsell, and will lead me out of Castalia tomorrow. Please be so kind as to listen to me a little while longer. My consciousness of a world outside our little province I owe not to my studies, in which this world occurred only as the remote past, but primarily to my fellow student Designori, who was a guest from outside, and later to my stay among the Benedictines and to Father Jacobus. What I have seen of the world with my own eyes is very little, but Father Jacobus gave me an inkling of what is called history, and it may be that in acquiring that I was laying the groundwork for the isolation into which I stumbled after my return. I returned from the monastery into a land where history virtually didn't exist, into a province of scholars and glass bead game players, a highly refined and extremely pleasant society, but one in which I seemed to stand entirely alone with my smattering of the world, my curiosity about that world, and my sympathy for it. To be sure, there was enough to compensate me here. There were several men I revered, so that I felt all at once abashed, delighted, and honored to work with them as their colleague. And there were a large number of well-bred and highly cultivated people. There was also work aplenty and a great many talented and lovable students. The trouble was that during my apprenticeship under Father Jacobus, I had made the discovery that I was not only a Castalian, but also a man, that the world, the whole world, concerned me and exerted certain claims upon me. Needs, wishes, demands, and obligations arose out of this discovery, but I was in no position to meet any of them. Life in the world, as the Castalian sees it, is something backward and inferior, a life of disorder and crudity, of passions and distractions, devoid of all that is beautiful or desirable. But the world and its life was in fact infinitely vaster and richer than the notions a Castalian has of it. It was full of change, history, struggles, and eternally new beginnings. It might be chaotic, but it was the home and native soil of all destinies, all exaltations, all arts, all humanity. It had produced languages, peoples, governments, cultures. It had also produced us and our Castalia, and would see all these things perish again, and yet survive. My teacher Jacobus had kindled in me a love for this world which was forever growing and seeking nourishment. But in Castalia there was nothing to nourish it. Here we were outside of the world. We ourselves were a small, perfect world, but one no longer changing, no longer growing. He took a deep breath and fell silent for a while. Since the president made no reply, and only looked expectantly at him, he gave a pensive nod and continued. For me, this meant bearing two burdens, and I did so for a good many years. I had to administer an important office and meet its responsibilities, and I had to deal with this love for the world. My office, I realized from the outside, must not suffer because of this love. On the contrary, I thought it ought to benefit. I hoped to carry out my duties as thoroughly and irreproachably as a magister is expected to. But if I should fall short in these, I nevertheless knew that inwardly I was more alert and alive than a good many of my more punctilious colleagues, and that I had something to give to my students and associates. I regarded it as my mission to expand Castalian life and thought slowly and gently, without breaking with tradition, to add to its warmth, to infuse it with new blood from the world and from history. By the happy workings of Providence, at the same time, outside in our country, a man of the world had precisely the same thought. He dreamed of a rapprochement and interpretation of Castalia and the world. That man was Plinio de Signori. Master Alexander's mouth took on a slightly sour expression as he said, "Well, yes, I have never hoped for anything very good from this man's influence upon you, any more than I have from your spoiled protege Tegularius. So it is de Signori who brought you to the point of a complete breach with the system?" "No, Domine, but he helped me, in part without being aware of it. He brought fresh air into my quietude. Through him I came into contact with the outside world again, and only then was I able to realize and to admit to myself that I was at the end of my career here, that I had lost all real joy in my work, and that it was time to put an end to the ordeal. One more stage had been left behind. I had passed through another area, another space, which this time was Castalia. "How you phrase that," Alexander remarked, shaking his head. "As if Castalian space were not large enough to serve a great many people worthily all their lives. Do you seriously believe that you have traversed this space and gone beyond it?" "Oh, no," Knecht replied with strong feeling. "I've never believed anything of the sort. When I say that I have reached the border of this space, I mean only that I have done all that I, as an official, could do here. In this sense I have reached my limits. For some time I have been standing at the frontier where my work as Magister Ludi has become eternal recurrence, an empty exercise and formula. I have been doing it without joy, without enthusiasm, sometimes even without faith. It was time to stop." Alexander sighed. "That is your view, but not the view of the order and its rules. A brother in our order has moods, and at times he wearies of his work. There is nothing new and remarkable about that. The rules show him the way to regain harmony, to find his center again. Had you forgotten that?" "I do not think so, Your Reverence. My administration is open to your inspection, and only recently, after you had received my circular letter, you conducted an investigation of the Players' Village and of me personally. You learned that the work was being done, that Secretariat and Archive were in order, that the Magister Ludi showed no signs of illness or vagary. I was able to carry on and sustain my strength and composure because of those very rules which you so skillfully taught me. But it cost me great effort, and now, unfortunately, it is costing me almost as much effort to convince you that I am not giving in to moods, whims, or vague yearnings. But whether or not I succeed, I insist at least on your acknowledging that my personality and my work were sound and useful up to the moment you last evaluated them. Is that asking too much of you?" Master Alexander's eyes twinkled rather sardonically. "My dear colleague," he said, "you address me as if we were two private individuals holding a casual conversation. But that applies only to yourself. You are now, in fact, a private individual. I am not, and whatever I think and say, I do not speak for myself, but as President of the Order, and he is responsible to his board for every word. What you are saying here today will remain without consequences. No matter how earnest your intentions, yours is the speech of a private person, urging his own interests. But for me, my office and responsibility continue, and what I say or do today may have consequences. I shall plead your cause before the board. You want the board to accept your account of the circumstances, or perhaps even acknowledge that you have made a correct decision. Your case, then, is that until yesterday, though you may have had all sorts of weird ideas in your head, you were an irreproachable Castalian, an exemplary magister, that you may have experienced temptations, spells of weariness, but that you consistently fought and overcame them. Let us assume that I accept that. But then, how am I to understand that the upright magister, who only yesterday obeyed every rule, today suddenly defects? You must admit this is more understandable in terms of a magister whose mind had in fact been impaired, who was suffering from psychic illness, so that he went on considering himself an excellent Castalian long after he had in reality ceased to be one. I also wonder why you make such a point of your having been a dutiful magister up to the very end. Since you have after all taken the step, broken your vow of obedience, and committed the act of desertion, why be concerned about establishing such a point? Knecht protested. I beg your pardon, Your Reverence. But why should I not be concerned about that? My name and reputation is involved, the memory I shall leave behind here. Also involved is the possibility of my working for Castalia on the outside. I am not here to salvage something for myself, or even to win the board's approval of my action. I counted on being regarded by my colleagues henceforth as a dubious phenomenon, and am prepared for that. But I don't want to be regarded as a traitor or madman. That is a verdict I cannot accept. I have done something you must disapprove of, but I have done it because I had to, because it was incumbent upon me, because that is my destiny, which I believe in and which I assume with good will. If you cannot concede this much, then I have been defeated, and have spoken with you in vain. Again and again it comes down to the same thing, Alexander replied. You want me to concede that in some circumstances an individual has the right to break the laws in which I believe, and which it is my task to represent. But I cannot simultaneously believe in our system and in your personal right to violate it. Please don't interrupt me. I can concede that to all appearances you are convinced of the rightness and meaningfulness of your dreadful step, and that you believe you have been called to take such action. You certainly don't expect me to approve the step itself. On the other hand, you have achieved something, for I have given up my initial thought of winning you back and changing your decision. I accept your withdrawal from the order, and shall pass on to the board the news of your voluntary resignation of your post. I cannot make any further concessions to you, Joseph Knecht. The Magister Ludi made a gesture of submission. Then he said quietly, Thank you. I have already given you the casket. I now turn over to you, as representative of the board, my notes on the state of affairs in Walsall, especially on the body of tutors, and my recommendations on the persons I consider possible successors to my office. He took a few folded sheets of paper from his pocket and placed them on the table. Then he rose, and the president rose also. Knecht took a step toward him, looked into his eyes for a long moment in sorrowful friendliness, then bowed and said, I had wanted to ask you to shake hands with me in parting, but I suppose I must forego this now. You have always been especially dear to me, and today has not changed that in any way. Goodbye, dear and revered master. Alexander stood still. He was rather pale. For a moment it seemed as though he meant to extend his hand to the departing magister. He felt his eyes growing moist. Then he inclined his head, responded to Knecht's bow, and let him go. After Knecht had closed the door behind him, the president stood unmoving, listening to the departing footsteps. When the last one had faded away and there was nothing more to be heard, he walked back and forth across the room for a while, until footsteps again sounded outside, and there was a soft knock at the door. The young servant entered and reported that a visitor wished to see him. "Tell him that I can receive him in an hour, and that I request him to be brief. There are urgent matters to attend to. No, wait a moment. Also, go to the Secretariat and inform the first secretary to convoke a meeting of the entire board for the day after tomorrow. All members must attend. Only severe illness will be acceptable as an excuse for absence. Then go to the steward and tell him I must leave for Walsall early tomorrow morning. Have my car ready by 7. "I beg your pardon," the young man said, "but the Magister Ludi's car is at your disposal." "How is that?" "His Reverence came by car yesterday. He has just left word that he is continuing his journey on foot and leaving the car here at your disposal." "Very well. I'll take the Walsall car tomorrow. Repeat, please." The servant repeated. The visitor will be received in an hour. He is to be brief. The first secretary is to convoke the board for the day after tomorrow, attendance mandatory, absence excused only on grounds of severe illness. Departure for Waldsell at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning in the Magister Ludi's car. Master Alexander took a deep breath once the young man had gone. He went over to the table where he had sat with Knecht. Still echoing in his ears were the footsteps of that incomprehensible man whom he had loved above all others, and who had inflicted this great grief upon him. He had loved this man ever since the days he had first helped him, and among other traits it had been Knecht's way of walking that had appealed so strongly to him, a firm, rhythmic step that was also light, almost airy, expressing something between dignity and childlikeness, between priestliness and the dance, a strange, lovable, and elegant walk that accorded with Knecht's face and voice. It accorded equally well with his peculiar way of being a Castalian and a Magister, his kind of mastership and serenity, which sometimes reminded Alexander of the aristocratically measured manner of his predecessor, Master Thomas, sometimes of the simple, heart-warming former music-master. So he had already left, in his haste, and on foot, who could say where? And probably he, Alexander, would never see him again, never again hear his laugh and watch the fine, long and slender fingers of his hand drawing the hieroglyphs of a Glass Bead Game phrase. Alexander reached for the sheets of paper that had been left lying on the table and began reading them. They amounted to a brief testament, extremely terse and matter-of-fact, frequently consisting only of cue words rather than sentences. Their purpose was to facilitate the board's work in the forthcoming investigation of the Vicus Lusorum and the appointment of a new magister. The laconic, sensible remarks stood there in neat, small letters, the words and handwriting just as uniquely and unmistakably typical of Joseph Knecht as his face, his voice, his gait. The board would scarcely find a man of his stature for his successor. Real masters and real personalities were all too rare, and each one was a matter of good luck and a pure gift, even here in Castalia, the province of the elite. Joseph Knecht enjoyed walking. It was years since he had last traveled on foot. In fact, when he reviewed the matter, it seemed to him that his last real walking tour had been the one that had long ago taken him from Mariafell's monastery back to Castalia, and to that annual game in Waldsell which had been so overshadowed by the death of Magister Thomas van der Trave, and had resulted in his own appointment to succeed the Magister Ludi. Ordinarily, when he thought back upon those days, let alone upon his student years on the bamboo grove, it had always been as if he were gazing from a cool, dull room out into broad, brightly sunlit landscapes, into the irrevocable past, the paradise of memory. Such recollections had always been, even when they were free of sadness, a vision of things remote and different, separated from the prosaic present by a mysterious festiveness. But now, on this bright and cheerful September afternoon, with the strong greens and browns all around him, and the ethereal, gently misted tones of blue verging into violet in the distance, as he trudged along at an easy pace, with frequent pauses to look about him, that walking tour of so long ago did not seem a distant paradise cut off from a resigned present. Rather, his present journey was the same as that of the past. The present Joseph Knecht was close as a brother to the Knecht of those days. Everything was new again, mysterious, promising. All that had been could recur, and many new things as well. It was long, long since he had looked out upon the day and the world and seen them as so unburdened, so beautiful and innocent. The happiness of freedom, of commanding his own destiny, flooded through him like a strong drink. How long it was since he had last had this feeling, last entertained this lovely and rapturous illusion. He pondered that, and recalled the time this precious feeling had first been bruised, then given a fatal blow. It had happened during a conversation with Magister Thomas, under the latter's friendly and ironic glance. He now recalled the strange sensation of that hour in which he had lost his freedom. It had not really been a pang, a burning anguish, but rather an onset of timidity, a faint shiver at the nape of his neck, an organic warning somewhere above his diaphragm, a change in the temperature and especially in the tempo of his consciousness of life. That anxious, constricting sensation, the hidden threat of suffocation of that fateful hour, was being recompensed now, or healed. The day before, during his drive to Hirschland, Knecht had decided that whatever might happen there, he would not repine. Now he forbade himself to think over the details of his conversations with Alexander, of his struggle with him and his struggle to win him. He left himself entirely open to the feeling of relaxation and freedom that filled him like the approach of evening leisure for a peasant whose day's work lies behind him. He was conscious of being safe and under no obligations. For a moment he was utterly dispensable, exempt from all responsibilities, not required to perform any tasks, to do any thinking. The bright, varicolored day surrounded him with a gentle radiance, wholly visual, wholly present, imposing no demands, having neither yesterday nor tomorrow. Now and then as he walked, he contentedly hummed one of the marching songs he and his schoolmates used to sing in 3 or 4 parts on outings, when he was an elite pupil at Eschholz. And out of that serene early morning of his life, small bright memories and sounds came fluttering to him like the chirping of birds. Under a cherry tree, with leaves already showing glints of purple, he stopped to rest and sat down in the grass. He reached into the pocket of his coat and took out a thing that Master Alexander would never have guessed he would be carrying, a small wooden flute, which he contemplated for a moment with tenderness. He had not owned this naive, childish-looking instrument for long, perhaps half a year, and he recalled with pleasure the day he had acquired it. He had ridden to Montport to discuss some problems of musical theory with Carlo Ferramonte. Their conversation had turned to the woodwinds of certain ages, and he had asked his friend to show him the Montport instrument collection. After an enjoyable stroll through several halls filled with old organ manuals, harps, lutes, and pianos, they had come to a building where instruments for the schools were stored. There, Knecht had seen a whole drawer full of such little flutes. He had examined and tried one, and asked his friend whether he might have one. Laughing, Carlo had invited him to choose. Still laughing, he had presented him with a receipt to sign. But then he had seriously explained the structure of the instrument, its fingering, and the technique of playing it. Knecht had taken the pretty little toy with him, and practiced on it occasionally, for he had not played a wind instrument since the recorder of his boyhood in Eschholz, and had often resolved to learn one again. In addition to scales, he had used a book of old melodies which Ferramonte had edited for beginners, and every so often the soft, sweet notes of the flute had sounded from the magister's garden or from his bedroom. He was far from a master of the instrument, but had learned to play a number of chorales and songs. He knew the music by heart, and also the words of a good many of them. One of these songs now sprang into his mind. It seemed highly suitable to the moment. He sang a few lines under his breath. "My body and head lay asleep like the dead, but now I stand strong, gay as the day is long, and turn my face to heaven." He brought the instrument to his lips and blew the melody, looking out into the radiant plain that arched toward the distant mountains, listening to the serenely devout song ringing out in the sweet notes of the flute, and feeling at one and content with the sky, the mountains, the song, and the day. With pleasure he felt the smooth wand between his fingers, and reflected that aside from the clothes on his body, This toy flute was the only piece of property he had allowed himself to take from Waldsell. In the course of years he had accumulated a good many things that could be more or less regarded as personal property, above all, writings, notebooks, and so on. He had left all these things behind. The player's village might use them as it wished. But he had taken the flute, and he was glad to have it with him. It was a modest and lovable traveling companion. On the second day he arrived in the capital on foot and called at the Designori home. Plinio sped down the steps to meet him and embraced him with emotion. "We have been longing for you and anxiously waiting for you," he exclaimed. "You have taken a great step, friend. May it bring good things to all of us. But to think that they let you go! I never would have believed it." Knecht laughed. "You see, I am here. But I'll tell you about it by and by. But now I'd like to greet my pupil, and of course your wife, and discuss everything with you, how we are going to arrange my new position. I'm eager to start on it." Plinio called a maid and told her to bring his son at once. "The young gentleman?" she asked, seemingly astonished, but hurried off while Plinio showed his friend to the guest-room. He began eagerly describing what preparations he had made for Knecht's arrival, and how he imagined the tutoring of young Tito would work out. Everything had been arranged as Knecht wished it, he said. Tito's mother, after some initial reluctance, had also grasped the reasons for these wishes and assented to them. The family owned a vacation cottage in the mountains, called Belpunt, pleasantly situated on a lake. There Knecht would live with his pupil for the time being. An elderly servant would keep house for them. She had already left several days ago to put the place in order. Of course, they could stay there only for a short time, at most till the onset of winter, but such isolation would certainly be beneficial, especially for the initial period. Fortunately, Tito loved the mountains and Belpunt, so the boy made no difficulties about going there. He was even looking forward to the project. At this point, Designori remembered that he had an album of photos of the house and its environs. He drew Knecht along into his study, searched eagerly for the album, and when he had found it, began showing his guest the house and describing the big farm kitchen living room, the tile stove, the arbors, the lake shore, the waterfall. "Does it seem nice to you?" he asked insistently. "Will you feel comfortable there?" "Why not?" Knecht said calmly. "But I wonder where Tito is. It's been quite some time since he was sent for." They chatted for a while longer. Then they heard footsteps outside. The door opened, but neither Tito nor the maid dispatched for him entered. It was Tito's mother, Madame Designori. Knecht rose to greet her. She extended her hand, smiling with a somewhat artificial friendliness. He could see beneath this polite smile an expression of anxiety and vexation. She barely managed a few words of welcome, and then turned to her husband and impetuously burst out with what was troubling her. "It's really so awkward," she exclaimed. "Imagine, the boy has vanished and is nowhere to be found." "Oh, well, I imagine he has gone out," Plinio said soothingly. "He'll be along." "Unfortunately, that isn't likely," his wife said. "He's been gone all day. I noticed his absence early this morning." "And why am I only now being told about it?" "Because I naturally expected him back any minute and saw no reason to trouble you needlessly. At first I took it for granted that he had simply gone for a walk. When he didn't return by noon, I began to worry. You were not lunching with us today, or I would have spoken to you. Even then I tried to persuade myself that it was simply carelessness on his part to make me wait so long. But it seems it wasn't that." "Permit me a question," Knecht said. "The young man knew I would be arriving soon, didn't he? And about your plans for him and me?" "Of course, Magister, and he seemed to be agreeable to those plans. Or at least he preferred having you as his teacher to being sent back to some school." "Oh, well," Knecht said, Then there is nothing to worry about. Your son is used to a great deal of freedom, Signora, especially of late. It's understandable that the prospect of a tutor and disciplinarian should be rather dreadful to him. And so he's made off at just the moment he was to be turned over to his new teacher, probably less with the hope of actually escaping his fate than with the thought that he'll lose nothing by postponement. Besides, he probably wanted to play a trick on his parents and the schoolmaster they've found for him, and so show his defiance to the whole world of grown-ups and teachers. Designori was glad that Knecht took the incident so lightly. He himself was full of anxiety. With his intense love for his son, he imagined all sorts of dangers. Perhaps he thought the boy had run away in all earnest. Perhaps he even intended to do himself some harm. It seemed as if they were going to pay for all their faults of omission and commission in the boy's upbringing, just when they were hoping to remedy things. Against Knecht's advice, he insisted that something must be done. He could not take this latest crisis passively, and worked himself up to a pitch of impatience and nervous agitation which his friend found deplorable. It was therefore decided to send messages to the homes of a few of Tito's friends, where he sometimes stayed overnight. Knecht was relieved when Madame Designori left to attend to this, and he had Plinio to himself for a while. "Plinio," he said, "you look as if your son had just been carried dead into the house. He is no longer a small child, and is not likely to have been run over or to have eaten deadly nightshade, so get a grip on yourself, my dear fellow. Since the boy isn't here, permit me for a moment to teach you something in his stead. I have been observing you, and find that you're not in the best of form. The moment an athlete receives an unexpected blow or pressure, his muscles react of their own accord by making the necessary movements, stretching or contracting automatically, and so helping him master the situation. You too, my pupil Plinio, the moment you received the blow, or what you exaggeratedly thought a blow, should have applied the first defensive measure against psychic assaults and resorted to slow, carefully controlled breathing. Instead, you breathe like an actor when he seeks to represent extreme emotion. You are not sufficiently armored. You people in the world seem to be singularly exposed to suffering and cares. There is something helpless and touching about your state, though often, when real suffering is involved and there is meaning to such pangs, it is also magnificent. But for everyday life, these protective measures are most valuable and should not be ignored. I will make sure that your son will be better armed when he needs such equipment. And now, Plinio, be so kind as to do a few exercises with me, so that I can see whether you have really forgotten it all." With the breathing exercises, which he guided by strictly rhythmical commands, he was able to distract Plinio from his self-induced agonies until he was willing to listen to rational arguments and dismantle the structure of alarm and anxiety he had so lavishly built. They went up to Tito's room, where Knecht looked benignly around at the confusion of boyish possessions. He picked up a book lying on the night-table, saw a slip of paper jutting from it, and found it was a note from the vanished boy. Laughing, he handed the paper to Designori, whose expression immediately brightened. Tito had written that he was leaving at daybreak and going to the mountains alone, where he would wait at Bellpunt for his new teacher. He hoped, the message said, that his parents would not mind his having this last little jaunt before his freedom was once more awfully restricted. His spirits sank when he thought of having to make this pleasant little journey accompanied by his teacher, a prisoner under supervision. "Quite understandable," Knecht commented. "I'll leave for Bellpunt tomorrow, and will probably find the boy already there. But now you'd better go to your wife and tell her the news." For the rest of the day, the atmosphere in the house was happy and relaxed. That evening, on Plinio's insistence, Knecht summarized the events of the past several days, and in particular described his 2 conversations with Master Alexander. On that evening he also scribbled some curious lines of verse on a scrap of paper, which is today in the possession of Tito de' Signori. That came about in the following way. Before dinner, his host had left him alone for an hour. Knecht saw a bookcase full of old books, which aroused his curiosity. Idle reading was another pleasure which he had unlearned and almost forgotten in years of abstinence. This moment now reminded him intensely of his student years. To stand before a shelf of unknown books, reach out at random, and choose one or another volume whose gilt or author's name, format, or the color of the binding appealed to him. With pleasure he glanced over the titles on the spines, and saw that the shelf consisted entirely of 19th and 20th century belles-lettres. Finally, he picked out a faded, cloth-bound volume whose title, Wisdom of the Brahmins, tempted him. Standing for a while, then seated, he leafed through the book, which contained many hundreds of didactic poems. It was a curious composite of learned loquacity and real wisdom, of Philistinism and genuine poetry. This strange and touching book held, it seemed to him, a good deal of important esoteric philosophy, but this was almost lost in the heavy-handed treatment. The best poems were by no means the ones in which the poet tried hard to give form to a theory or truth, but the ones in which the poet's temperament, his capacity for love, his sincerity, humanitarianism, and deep respectability found expression. As Knecht delved into the book, with mixed feelings of esteem and amusement, he was struck by a stanza which he absorbed with satisfaction and assent. Reading it, he nodded smilingly, as if it had been specially sent to him for this day in his life. It went, "Our days are precious, but we gladly see them going. If in their place we find a thing more precious growing, a rare exotic plant, our gardener's heart delighting, a child whom we are teaching, a booklet we are writing." He opened the drawer of the desk, found a sheet of paper, and copied out the stanza. Later he showed it to Plinio and commented, "I liked these lines. There was something special about them. They are so dry, and at the same time so deeply felt. And they so well suit me in my momentary situation and mood. Although I am not a gardener, and don't intend to devote my days to the cultivation of an exotic plant, I am a teacher, and am on the way to my task, to the child I mean to teach. How I am looking forward to it! As for the author of these lines, the poet Rückert, I would suppose he possessed all three of these noble passions, that of gardener, teacher, and writer. I suppose the third ranked highest with him. He shapes the stanzas so that it receives the maximum stress, and dotes so on the subject of his passion that he becomes positively tender, and calls it not a book, but a booklet. How touching that is!" Plinio laughed. "Who knows," he observed, "whether the diminutive is not just a rhymester's trick because he needed a two-syllable instead of a one-syllable word there?" "Let us not underestimate him," Knecht replied. "A man who wrote tens of thousands of lines of verse in his lifetime would not be driven into a corner by shabby metrical necessity. No, just listen to it. How loving it sounds, and at the same time just a little sheepish. A booklet we are writing. Perhaps it isn't only his affection that transforms the book into a booklet. Perhaps he also meant it apologetically. Probably this poet was so devoted to his writing that now and again he felt his own passion for making books as a kind of vice. In that case, the word booklet would have not only the sense of an endearment, but also a propitiating, disarming connotation, as when a gambler invites someone to a little game, or a drinker asks for just a drop. Well, these are speculations. In any case, I find myself in full agreement and sympathy with the poet about the child he wishes to teach and the booklet he wants to write. Because I am not only familiar with the passion for teaching, I'm also rather inclined to do a little scribbling, too. And now that I have liberated myself from officialdom, I am much drawn to the idea of using my leisure and good spirits one of these days to write a book, or rather a booklet, a little thing for friends and those who share my views." "What about?" Designori asked with curiosity. "Oh, anything. The subject would not matter. It would only be a pretext for me to seclude myself and enjoy the happiness of having a great deal of leisure. The tone would be what mattered to me, a proper mean between the solemn and the intimate, earnestness and jest, a tone not of instruction, but of friendly communication and discourse on various things I think I have learned. I don't suppose the way this poet Friedrich Rückert mixes instruction and thinking, information and casual talk, would be my way, and yet something about it appeals strongly to me. It is personal and yet not arbitrary, playful and yet submits to strict rules of form. I like that. Well, for the present I shall not enter upon the joys and problems of writing little books. I have to keep my mind on other tasks. But some time later, I imagine, I might very well experience the joys of authorship, of the sort I foresee, an easy-going but careful examination of things not just for my solitary pleasure, but always with a few good friends and readers in mind." Next morning, Knecht set out for Bellpunt. Designori had wanted to accompany him, but Knecht had firmly vetoed the idea, and when the father attempted to press it, had almost snapped at him, "The boy will have enough to do coming to terms with this nuisance of a new teacher," he said curtly. "To foist his father on him at the same time would scarcely help things." As he rode through the brisk September morning in the car Plinio had hired for him, his good humor of yesterday returned. He chatted frequently with the chauffeur, asking him to stop or drive slowly every so often when the landscape looked particularly attractive, and several times he played his little flute. It was a beautiful and exciting little ride from the lowlands in which the capital lay toward the foothills and on into the high mountains. The journey also led from fading summer deeper into autumn. About noon the last great climb began. Over sweeping serpentines, through thinning evergreen forest, past foaming mountain streams roaring between cliffs, over bridges, and by solitary massive walled farmhouses with tiny windows, into a stony, ever rougher and more austere world of mountains, amid whose bleakness and sobriety the flowering meadows bloomed like tiny paradises with doubled loveliness. The small cottage they reached at last was tucked away near a mountain lake, among grey cliffs with which it scarcely contrasted. The traveller was at once aware of the austerity, even the gloom, of this kind of building, which so accorded with the ruggedness of the mountains. But then a cheerful smile lighted his face, for in the open door of the house he saw a figure standing, a young man in a colourful jacket and shorts. It could only be his pupil Tito, and although he had not really been seriously concerned about the fugitive, he nevertheless breathed a grateful sigh of relief. If Tito were here and welcoming his teacher on the threshold, all was well. That disposed of a good many possible complications he had been considering during the ride. The boy came forward to meet him, smiling, friendly, and a little embarrassed. While helping Knecht out of the car, he said, "I didn't mean to be horrid, letting you travel alone." And before Knecht had a chance to reply, he added trustfully, "I think you understood my feeling. Otherwise you would have brought my father with you. I've already let him know that I arrived safely." Laughing, Knecht shook hands with the boy. He was guided into the house, where the servant welcomed him and promised that supper would soon be ready. Yielding to an unwonted need, he lay down for a little while before the meal, and only then realized that he was curiously tired, in fact exhausted, from the lovely automobile trip. During the evening, moreover, as he chatted with his pupil and looked at Tito's collections of mountain flowers and butterflies, his fatigue increased. He even felt something akin to giddiness, a kind of emptiness in the head that he had never experienced before, and an annoying weakness and irregularity of his heartbeat. But he continued to sit with Tito until their agreed bedtime, and took pains not to show any sign that he was not feeling well. Tito was somewhat surprised that the Magister said not a word about the beginning of school, schedules, report cards, and similar matters. In fact, when he ventured to capitalize on this good mood and proposed a long walk for the morning to acquaint his teacher with his new surroundings, the proposal was readily accepted. "I'm looking forward to the walk," Knecht added, "and want to ask you a favor right now. While looking at your plant collection, I could see that you know far more about mountain plants than I do. One of the purposes of our being together is, among other things, that we exchange knowledge and reach a balance with each other. Let us begin by your checking over my meager understanding of botany and helping me go further in this field." By the time they bade each other good night, Tito was in excellent spirits and had made some good resolutions. Once again he had found this Magister Knecht very much to his liking. Without using fancy language and going on about scholarship, virtue, the aristocracy of intellect, and so on, as his school-teachers were prone to do, this serene, friendly man had something in his manner and his speech that imposed an obligation and brought out your good, chivalric, higher aspirations and forces. It could be fun, and sometimes you felt it as a badge of honor to deceive and outwit the ordinary schoolmaster, but in the presence of this man such notions never even occurred to you. He was— why, what exactly was he like? Tito reflected on this, trying to determine what it was about this stranger that was so likable and at the same time so impressive. He decided that it was the man's nobility, his innate aristocratic quality. This was what drew him to Knecht, this above all. He was a nobleman, although no one knew his family, and his father might have been a shoemaker. He was nobler and more aristocratic than most of the people Tito knew, more aristocratic than Tito's own father. The boy, who highly prized the patrician instincts and traditions of his house, and could not forgive his father for having broken with them, was for the first time encountering intellectual aristocracy, cultivated nobility. Knecht was an example of that power which, under favorable conditions, can sometimes work miracles, overleaping a long succession of ancestors, and within a single human life transforming a plebeian child into a member of the highest nobility. In the proud and fiery boy's heart there stirred an inkling that to belong to this kind of nobility, and to serve it, might be a duty and honor for him, that here, perhaps, embodied in this teacher, who, for all his gentleness and friendliness, was a nobleman through and through, the meaning of his own life was drawing near to him, that his goals were being set. Knecht, after being shown to his room, did not lie down at once, although he craved rest. The evening had cost him a great effort. He had found it difficult to comport himself so that nothing in his expression, posture, or voice would reveal his peculiar fatigue or depression or illness to the young man, who was undoubtedly observing him closely. Still, he seemed to have succeeded. But now he had to meet and master this vacuity, this nausea, this alarming giddiness, this deathly tiredness, which was at the same time restiveness. He could master it only if he recognized its cause. This was not hard to find, although it took him some time. The reason for his indisposition, he decided, was simply the journey which had taken him in so short a time from the lowlands to an altitude of close to 7,000 feet. Except for a few outings in his early youth, he was unaccustomed to such heights and had not reacted well to the rapid ascent. Probably this disability would last another day or two. If it did not disappear by then, he would have to return home with Tito and the housekeeper, in which case Plinio's plan for a stay in lovely Belpunt would come to nothing. That would be a pity, but no great misfortune. After these reflections he went to bed, and since sleep refused to come, spent the night partly in reviewing his travels since his departure from Waldsee, partly trying to quiet his heartbeat and his exacerbated nerves. He also thought a good deal about his pupil, with pleasure, but without making any plans. It seemed to him wiser to tame this noble but refractory colt by kindness and slow domestication. Nothing must be hasty or forced in this case. He thought that he would gradually bring the boy to an awareness of his gifts and powers, and at the same time nourish in him that noble curiosity, that aristocratic dissatisfaction from which springs love for the sciences, the humanities, and the arts. The task was a rewarding one, and his pupil was not just any talented young man whom he had to awaken and train. As the only son of a wealthy and influential patrician, he was also a future leader, one of the social and political shapers of the country and the nation, destined to command and to be imitated. Castalia had failed the Designori family. It had not educated Tito's father thoroughly enough, had not made him strong enough for his difficult position, poised between the world and culture. As a result, gifted and charming young Plinio had become an unhappy man, with a life out of balance and ill-managed. As a further result, his only son was endangered in his turn, and had been drawn into his father's difficulties. Here was something to heal and make good. Here was a debt to be paid. It seemed meaningful and gladdened him that this task should fall to him of all persons, to him, the disobedient and seemingly apostate Castalian. In the morning, when he sensed the house awakening, he rose. Finding a dressing-gown laid ready beside his bed, he put it on, and stepped out through the rear door that Tito had shown him the night before, into the arcade that connected the house with the bath hut by the lake. Before him the little lake lay motionless, gray-green. Further off was a steep cliff, its sharp, jagged crest still in shadow, rearing sheer and cold into the thin, greenish, cool morning sky. But he could sense that the sun had already risen behind this crest. Tiny splinters of its light glittered here and there on corners of rock. In a few minutes the sun would appear over the crenellations of the mountain and flood lake and valley below with light. In a mood of earnest attentiveness, Knecht studied the scene, whose stillness, gravity, and beauty he felt as unfamiliar and nevertheless of deep concern and instructiveness to him. Now, even more strongly than during yesterday's ride, he felt the ponderousness, the coolness and dignified strangeness of this mountain world, which does not meet men halfway, does not invite them, scarcely tolerates them. And it seemed to him strange and significant that his first step into the freedom of life in the world should have led him to this very place, to this silent and cold grandeur. Tito appeared in bathing trunks. He shook hands with the Magister, and pointing to the cliffs opposite, said, "You've come at just the right moment. The sun will be rising in a minute. Oh, it's glorious up here." Knecht gave him a friendly nod. He had learned long ago that Tito was an early riser, a runner, wrestler, and hiker, if only from protest against his father's casual, unsoldierly, comfort-loving ways. For the same reason, he refused to drink wine. These leanings occasionally led him into a pose of being an anti-intellectual child of nature. The Designories seemed to have this bent for exaggeration. But Knecht welcomed it all, and was determined to share his interest in sports as a means for winning over and taming the temperamental young man. It would be only one means among several, and not at all the most important. Music, for example, would lead them much further. Of course, he had no thought of matching the young man in physical feats, let alone surpassing him. But harmless participation would suffice to show the boy that his tutor was neither a coward nor a mere bookworm. Tito looked eagerly toward the dark crest of the mountain, behind which the sky pulsed in the morning light. Now a fragment of the rocky ridge flashed violently like a glowing metal beginning to melt. The crest blurred and seemed suddenly lower, as if it were melting down, and from the fiery gap the dazzling sun appeared. Simultaneously the ground, the house, and their shore of the lake were illuminated, and the two, standing in the strong radiance, instantly felt the delightful warmth of this light. The boy, filled with the solemn beauty of the moment and the glorious sensation of his youth and strength, stretched his limbs with rhythmic arm movements, which his whole body soon took up, celebrating the break of day in an enthusiastic dance and expressing his deep oneness with the surging, radiant elements. His steps flew in joyous homage toward the victorious sun and reverently retreated from it. His outspread arms embraced mountain, lake, and sky. Kneeling, he seemed to pay tribute to the Earth Mother, and extending his hands to the waters of the lake. He offered himself, his youth, his freedom, his burning sense of his own life, like a festive sacrifice to the powers. The sunlight gleamed on his tanned shoulders. His eyes were half closed to the dazzle. His young face stared mask-like, with an expression of inspired, almost fanatical gravity. The Magister, too, was overpowered by the solemn spectacle of dawn breaking in this silent, rocky solitude. But he was even more fascinated by the human spectacle taking place before his eyes, this ceremonial dance performed by his pupil to welcome the morning and the sun. The dance elevated this moody, immature youth, conferring upon him a priestly solemnity, suddenly, in a single moment, irradiating and revealing to the onlooker his deepest and noblest tendencies, gifts, and destinies, just as the appearance of the sun opened and illuminated this cold, gloomy mountain dale. In this moment, the young man seemed to him stronger and more impressive than he had hitherto thought, but also harder, more inaccessible, more remote from culture, more pagan. This ceremonial and sacrificial dance under the sign of Pan meant more than young Plinio's speeches and verse-making ever had. It raised the boy several stages higher, but also made him seem more alien, more elusive, less obedient to any summons. The boy himself was in the grip of his impulse, without knowing what was happening to him. He was not performing a dance he already knew, a dance he had practiced before. This was no familiar rite of celebrating sun and morning that he had long ago invented. Only later would he realize that his dance and his transported state in general were only partly caused by the mountain air, the sun, the dawn, his sense of freedom. They were also a response to the change awaiting him, the new chapter in his young life that had come in the friendly and awe-inspiring form of the Magister. In that morning hour, many elements conspired in the soul of young Tito to shape his destiny and distinguish this hour above 1,000 others as a high, a festive, a consecrated time. Without knowing what he was doing, asking no questions, he obeyed the command of this ecstatic moment, danced his worship, prayed to the sun, professed with devout movements and gestures his joy, his faith in life, his piety and reverence, both proudly and submissively offered up in the dance his devout soul as a sacrifice to the sun and the gods, and no less to the man he admired and feared, the sage and musician, the master of the magic game who had come to him from mysterious realms, his future teacher and friend. All this, like the torrent of light from the sunrise, lasted only a few minutes. Stirred to the core, Knecht watched the wonderful show, in which his pupil before his eyes changed and revealed himself, presenting himself in a new light, alien and entirely his equal. Both of them stood on the walk between house and hut, bathed in the radiance from the east and deeply shaken by their experience. Tito, having barely completed the last step of his dance, awoke from his ecstasy and stood still, like an animal surprised in solitary play, aware that he was not alone, that not only had he experienced and performed something unusual, but that he had also had a spectator. His first thought was how to extricate himself from the situation, which struck him now as somehow dangerous and shaming. He had to act vigorously and smash the magic of these strange moments, which had totally absorbed and overwhelmed him. His face, but a moment before an ageless, stern mask, assumed a childish and rather foolish expression, like that of a person awakened too abruptly from a deep sleep. His knees swayed slightly. He looked into his teacher's face with vapid astonishment, and in sudden haste, as though something very important had just occurred to him, something he had neglected, he stretched out his right arm and pointed toward the opposite shore of the lake, which, along with half the lake's waters, still lay in the great, rapidly contracting shadow of the cliff whose top had already been conquered by the brilliance of the dawn. "If we swim very fast," he called out with boyish impetuosity, "we can just reach the other shore before the sun." The words were barely uttered, the challenge to a swimming race with the sun barely issued, when Tito, with a tremendous leap, plunged headfirst into the lake, as if in his high spirits or his shyness he could not get away fast enough and obliterate all memory of the preceding ritual by intensified activity. The water splashed up and closed around him. A few moments later his head, shoulders, and arms reappeared and remained visible on the blue-green surface, swiftly moving away. Knecht had not, when he came out, had in mind to bathe or swim. Both air and water were much too cool, and after his night of semi-illness, swimming would probably do him little good. But now, in the beautiful sunlight, stirred by the scene he had just witnessed, and with his pupil urging him into the water in this comradely fashion, he found the venture less deterring. Above all, he feared that the promise born in this morning hour would be blasted if he disappointed the boy by opposing cool adult rationality to this invitation to a test of strength. It was true that his feeling of weakness and uncertainty, incurred by the rapid ascent into the mountains, warned him to be careful. But perhaps this indisposition could be soonest routed by forcing matters and meeting it head-on. The summons was stronger than the warning, his will stronger than his instinct. He quickly shed the light dressing-gown, took a deep breath, and threw himself into the water at the same spot where his pupil had dived. The lake, fed by glacial waters so that even in the warmest days of summer one had to be inured to it, received him with an icy cold, slashing in its enmity. He had steeled himself for a thorough chilling, but not for this fierce cold which seemed to surround him with leaping flames, and after a moment of fiery burning, began to penetrate rapidly into him. After the dive he had risen quickly to the surface, caught sight of Tito swimming far ahead of him, felt bitterly assailed by this icy, wild, hostile element, but still believed he could lessen the distance, that he was engaging in the swimming race, was fighting for the boy's respect and comradeship, for his soul, when he was already fighting with death, who had thrown him and was now holding him in a wrestler's grip. Fighting with all his strength, Knecht held him off as long as his heart continued to beat. The young swimmer had looked back frequently, and seen with satisfaction that the Magister had followed him into the water. Now he peered once again, no longer saw him, and became uneasy. He looked and called, then turned and swam rapidly back. He could not find him. Swimming and diving, he searched for the lost swimmer until his strength, too, began to give out in the bitter cold. Staggering, breathless, he reached land at last, saw the dressing-gown lying on the shore, and picking it up, began mechanically rubbing his body and limbs until the numbed skin warmed again. Stunned, he sat down in the sunlight and stared into the water, whose cool blue-green now blinked at him strangely empty, alien, and evil. He felt overpowered by perplexity and deep sorrow, for with the waning of his physical weakness, awareness and the terror of what had happened returned to him. "Oh," he thought in grief and horror, "now I am guilty of his death." And only now, when there was no longer need to save his pride or offer resistance, he felt in shock and sorrow how dear this man had already become to him. And since, in spite of all rational objections, he felt responsible for the master's death, there came over him, with a premonitory shudder of awe, a sense that this guilt would utterly change him and his life, and would demand much greater things of him than he had ever before demanded of himself. Joseph Knecht's posthumous writings. The poems of Knecht's student years. Lament. No permanence is ours, we are a wave that flows to fit whatever form it finds. Through day or night, cathedral or the cave, we pass forever, craving form that binds. Mold after mold we fill and never rest. We find no home where joy or grief runs deep. We move, we are the everlasting guest. No field nor plough is ours, we do not reap. What God would make of us remains unknown. He plays, we are the clay to his desire. Plastic and mute, we neither laugh nor groan. He needs, but never gives us to the fire. To stiffen into stone, to persevere, we long forever for the right to stay. But all that ever stays with us is fear, and we shall never rest upon our way. A compromise. The men of principled simplicity will have no traffic with our subtle doubt. The world is flat, they tell us, and they shout, the myth of depth is an absurdity. For if there were additional dimensions, beside the good old pair we'll always cherish, how could a man live safely without tensions? How could he live and not expect to perish? In order peacefully to coexist, let us strike one dimension off our list. If they are right, those men of principle, and life in depth is so inimical, the third dimension is dispensable. But secretly we thirst. Graceful as dancers arabesque and bow, our lives appear serene and without stress, a gentle dance around pure nothingness, to which we sacrifice the here and now. Our dreams are lovely, and our game is bright, so finely tuned with many artful turns, but deep beneath the tranquil surface burns longing for blood, barbarity, and night. Freely our life revolves, and every breath is free as air. We live so playfully, but secretly we crave reality, begetting birth and suffering and death. Alphabets. From time to time we take our pen in hand and scribble symbols on a blank white sheet. Their meaning is at everyone's command. It is a game whose rules are nice and neat. But if a savage or a moon-man came and found a page, a furrowed runic field, and curiously studied lines and frame, how strange would be the world that they revealed! A magic gallery of oddities. He would see A and B as man and beast, as moving tongues or arms or legs or eyes, now slow, now rushing, all constraint released, like prints of ravens' feet upon the snow. He'd hop about with them, fly to and fro, and see 1,000 worlds of might have been hidden within the black and frozen symbols, beneath the ornate strokes, the thick and thin. He'd see the way love burns and anguish trembles. He'd wonder, laugh, shake with fear, and weep, because beyond this cipher's cross-barred keep, he'd see the world in all its aimless passion, diminished, dwarfed, and spellbound in the symbols, and rigorously marching prisoner fashion. He'd think each sign all others so resembles, that love of life and death, or lust and anguish, are simply twins whom no one can distinguish. Until at last the savage with a sound of mortal terror lights and stirs a fire, chants and beats his brow against the ground, and consecrates the writing to his pyre. Perhaps before his consciousness is drowned, in slumber there will come to him some sense of how this world of magic fraudulence, this horror utterly behind endurance, has vanished as if it had never been. He'll sigh and smile and feel all right again. On reading an old philosopher. These noble thoughts beguiled us yesterday. We savored them like choicest vintage wines. But now they sour, meaning seep away, much like a page of music from whose vines the clefs and sharps are carelessly erased. Take from a house the center of gravity, it sways and falls apart, all sense debased, cacophony, what had been harmony. So, too, a face we saw as old and wise, loved and respected, can wrinkle, craze, as, ripe for death, the mind deserts the eyes, leaving a pitiful, empty, shriveled maze. So, too, can ecstasy stir every sense, and barely felt can quickly turn to gall, as if there dwelt within us cognizance that everything must wither, die, and fall. Yet still above this veil of endless dying, man's spirit, struggling incorruptibly, painfully raises beacons, death defying, and wins, by longing, immortality. The Last Glass Bead Game Player. The colored beads, his playthings, in his hand, he sits head bent, around him lies a land laid waste by war and ravaged by disease, growing on rubble, ivy hums with bees. A weary peace with muted psalmody sounds in a world of aged tranquility. The old man tallies up his colored beads. He fits a blue one here, a white one there, makes sure a large one or a small precedes, and shapes his game ring with devoted care. Time was he had won greatness in the game, had mastered many tongues and many arts, had known the world, traveled in foreign parts, from pole to pole, no limits to his fame. Around him pupils, colleagues always pressed. Now he is old, worn out, his life is lees. Disciples come no longer to be blessed, nor masters to invite an argument. All are gone, and the temples, libraries, and schools of Castalia are no more, at rest amid the ruins, the glass beads in his hand, those hieroglyphs once so significant, that now are only colored bits of glass. He lets them roll until their force is spent, and silently they vanish in the sand. A Toccata by Bach. Frozen silence. Darkness prevails on darkness. One shaft of light breaks through the jagged clouds, coming from nothingness to penetrate the depths, compound the night with day, build length and breadth, prefigure peak and ridge, declivities, redoubts, a loose blue atmosphere, earth's deep, dense fullness. That brilliant shaft dissevers teeming generation into both deed and war, and in a frenzy of creation ignites a gleaming, terrified new world. All changes where the seeds of light descend, order arises, magnificence is heard in praise of life, of victory to light's great end. The mighty urge glides on, to move its power into all creatures' being, recalling far divinity, the spirit of God's doing. Now joy and pain, words, art, and song, world towering on world in arching victory throng, with impulse, mind, contention, pleasure, love. Translated by Alex Page. A Dream. Guest at a monastery in the hills, I stepped, when all the monks had gone to pray, into a book-lined room. Along the walls, glittering in the light of fading day, I saw a multitude of vellum spines with marvelous inscriptions. Eagerly, impelled by rapturous curiosity, I picked the nearest book and read the lines, "The squaring of the circle, final stage." I thought, I'll take this and read every page. A quarto volume, leather-tooled in gold, gave promise of a story still untold. How Adam also ate of the other tree. The other tree? Which one? The tree of life? Is Adam then immortal? Now I could see no chance had brought me to this library. I spied the back and edges of a folio aglow with all the colors of the rainbow, its hand-painted title stating a decree. The interrelationships of hues and sound, proof that for every color may be found in music a proper corresponding key. Choirs of colors sparkled before my eyes, and now I was beginning to surmise, here was the library of paradise. To all the questions that had driven me, all answers now could be given me. Here I could quench my thirst to understand, for here all knowledge stood at my command. There was provision here for every need. A title full of promise on each book responded to my every rapid look. Here there was fruit to satisfy the greed of any student's timid aspirations, of any master's bold investigations. Here was the inner meaning, here the key to poetry, to wisdom, and to science. Magic and erudition, in alliance, opened the door to every mystery. These books provided pledges of all power to him who came here at this magic hour. A lectern stood nearby, with hands that shook. I placed upon it one enticing book, deciphered at a glance the picture writing, as in a dream we find ourselves reciting a poem or lesson we have never learned. At once I soared aloft to starry spaces of the soul, and with the zodiac turned, where all the revelations of all races, whatever intuition was divined, millennial experience of all nations, harmoniously met in new relations, old insights with new symbols recombined, so that in minutes or in hours, as I read, I traced once more the whole path of mankind, and all that men have ever done and said disclosed its inner meaning to my mind. I read and saw those hieroglyphic forms couple and part and coalesce in swarms, dance for a while together, separate, once more in newer patterns integrate, a kaleidoscope of endless metaphors, and each some vaster, fresher sense explores. Bedazzled by these sights, I looked away from the book to give my eyes a moment's rest, and saw that I was not the only guest. An old man stood before that grand array of tomes. Perhaps he was the archivist. I saw that he was earnestly intent upon some task, and I could not resist a strange conviction that I had to know the manner of his work and what it meant. I watched the old man, with frail hand and slow, remove a volume and inspect what stood written upon its back, then saw him blow with pallid lips upon the title. Could a title possibly be more alluring or offer greater promise of enduring delight? But now his finger wiped across the spine. I saw it silently erase the name and watched with fearful sense of loss as he inscribed another in its place, and then moved on to smilingly efface one more, but only a newer title to emboss. For a long while I looked at him bemused, then turned, since reason totally refused to understand the meaning of his actions. Back to my book, I'd seen but a few lines, and found I could no longer read the signs, or even see the rows of images. The world of symbols I had barely entered, that had stirred me to such transports of bliss, in which a universe of meaning centered seemed to dissolve and rush away, careen and reel and shake in feverish contractions, and fade out, leaving nothing to be seen but empty parchment with a hoary sheen. I felt a hand upon me, felt it slide over my shoulder. The old man stood beside my lectern, and I shuddered while he took my book and with a subtle smile brushed his finger lightly to elide the former title, then began to write new promises and problems, novel inquiries, new formulas for ancient mysteries. Without a word he plied his magic style, then with my book he disappeared from sight. Worship. In the beginning was the rule of sacred kings, who hallowed field, grain, plough, who handed down the law of sacrifices, set the bounds to mortal men forever hungering, for the invisible one's just ordinance that holds the sun and moon in perfect balance, and whose forms in their eternal radiance feel no suffering nor no death's ambience. Long ago the sons of the gods, the sacred line, passed, and mankind remained alone, embroiled in pleasure and pain, cut off from being, condemned to change, unhallowed, unconfined. But intimations of the true life never died, and it is for us, in this time of harm, to keep, in metaphor and symbol and in psalm, reminders of that former sacred reverence. Perhaps some day the darkness will be banned. Perhaps some day the times will turn about. The sun will once more rule us as our God and take the sacrifices from our hands. Soap bubbles. From years of study and of contemplation, an old man brews a work of clarity, a gay and involuted dissertation, discoursing on sweet wisdom playfully. An eager student, bent on storming heights, has delved in archives and in libraries, but adds the touch of genius when he writes a first book full of deepest subtleties. A boy, with bowl and straw, sits and blows, filling with breath the bubbles from the bowl. Each praises like a hymn, and each one glows. Into the filmy beads he blows his soul. Old man, student, boy, all these three, out of the Maya foam of the universe, create illusions, none is better or worse. But in each of them the light of eternity sees its reflection and burns more joyfully. After dipping into the Summa contra Gentiles. To truth, it seems to us, life once was nearer. The world ordered, intelligences clearer, wisdom and knowledge were not yet divided. They lived far more serenely, many-sided. Those ancients of whom Plato, the Chinese, relate their incandescent verities. Whenever we entered the temple of Aquinas, the graceful Summa contra Gentiles, a new world greeted us, sweet, mature, a world of truth clarified and pure. There all seemed lucid, nature charged with mind, man moving from God to him as he designed. The law in one great formulary bound, forming a whole, a still unbroken round. But we who belong to his posterity seem condemned to doubt and irony, to journeys in the wilderness, to strife, obsessions and longings for a better life. But if our children's children undergo such sufferings as ours, they will bestow praise upon us as blessed and as wise. We will appear transfigured in their eyes. For out of our lives' harsh cacophonies, they will hear only fading harmonies, the legends of an anguish often told, the echoes of contentions long grown cold. And those of us who trust ourselves the least, who doubt and question most, these, it may be, will make their mark upon eternity, and youth will turn to them as to a feast. The time may come when a man who confessed his self-doubts will be ranked among the blessed, who never suffered anguish or knew fear, whose times were times of glory and good cheer, who lived like children simple, happy lives. For in us, too, is part of that eternal mind, which through the eons calls to brothers of its kind. Both you and I will pass, but it survives. Stages. As every flower fades, and as all youth departs, so life at every stage, so every virtue, so our grasp of truth, blooms in its day, and may not last forever. Since life may summon us at every age, be ready, heart, for parting, new endeavor. Be ready, bravely and without remorse, to find new light that old ties cannot give. In all beginnings dwells a magic force, for guarding us and helping us to live. Serenely let us move to distant places, and let no sentiments of home detain us. The cosmic spirit seeks not to restrain us, but lifts us stage by stage to wider spaces. If we accept the home of our own making, familiar habit makes for indolence. We must prepare for parting and leave-taking, or else remain the slaves of permanence. Even the hour of our death may send us speeding on to fresh and newer spaces, and life may summon us to newer races. So be it, heart. Bid farewell without end. The Glass Bead Game. We reenact with reverent attention the universal chord, the master's harmony, evoking in unsullied communion minds and times of highest sanctity. We draw upon the iconography whose mystery is able to contain the boundlessness, the storm of all existence, give chaos form, and hold our lives in rein. The pattern sings like crystal constellations, and when we tell our beads we serve the whole, and cannot be dislodged or misdirected, held in the orbit of the cosmic soul. The Three Lives. Chapter 1. The Rainmaker. It was many thousands of years ago when women ruled. In tribe and family, mothers and grandmothers were revered and obeyed. Much more was made of the birth of a girl than of a boy. There was an ancestress in the village, 100 or more years ago, whom everyone revered and feared as if she were a queen, although in the memory of man she had seldom lifted a finger or spoken a word. Many a day she sat by the entrance to her hut, a retinue of ministering kinsfolk around her, and the women of the village came to pay their respects, to tell her their affairs, to show her their children and ask her blessing on them. The pregnant women came to ask her to touch their bellies and name the expected child. Sometimes the tribal mother would give the touch, sometimes she only nodded or shook her head, or else remained motionless. She rarely said anything. She was merely there, sitting and ruling, sitting with her yellowish-white hair falling in thin strands around her leathery, far-sighted eagle's face, sitting and receiving veneration, presents, requests, news, reports, accusations, sitting and known to all as the mother of 7 daughters and the grandmother and ancestor of many grandchildren and great-grandchildren, sitting and holding in those wrinkled features and back of that brown forehead the wisdom, the tradition, the law, the morality, and the honor of the village. It was a spring evening, overcast, the darkness falling early. The ancient herself was not sitting in front of the mud hut. In her stead was her daughter, almost as white-haired and stately, and not much younger. She sat and rested. Her seat was the threshold, a flat fieldstone, covered with a skin in cold weather. At a little distance from her, a few children, women, and boys squatted in a semicircle in the sand or grass. They squatted here every evening that it was not raining or too cold, for they wanted to hear the ancient's daughter tell stories or sing spells. Formerly, the ancient herself had done this, but now that she was too old and no longer communicative, her daughter took her place. Just as she had learned all the stories and spells from the old woman, so she also had her voice, her figure, the quiet dignity of her bearing, her movements, and her language. The younger listeners knew her much better than her mother, and by now scarcely realized that she sat here in another's place, passing on the tales and wisdom of the tribe. The wellspring of knowledge flowed from her lips on these evenings. She preserved the tribe's treasure under her white hair. Behind her gently furrowed old brow dwelt the memory and the mind of the village. Anyone who knew any spells or stories had learned them from her. Aside from her and the ancient, there was only one other guardian of knowledge in the tribe, but he remained hidden most of the time, a mysterious and extremely silent man, the Rainmaker, or, as he was also called, the Weather-Maker. Crouching among the listeners was also the boy Knecht, and beside him a little girl named Ada. He was fond of this girl, often played with her and protected her, not out of love, for he knew nothing of that as yet, was still too much a child, but because she was the Rainmaker's daughter. Knecht adored the Rainmaker. Next to the ancient and her daughter, he admired no one so strongly as the Rainmaker. But the others were women. You could venerate and fear them, but you could not conceive the thought, could not possibly cherish the wish to become what they were. The Rainmaker was a rather unapproachable man. It was not easy for a boy to stay near him. That had to be managed in roundabout ways, and one of these roundabout ways to the Rainmaker was Knecht's concern for his child. As often as possible he went to the Rainmaker's somewhat isolated hut to fetch her. Then he would sit with her, listening to the old woman's tales, and later take her home. He had done this today, and now he was squatting beside her in the dark group, listening. Today the old woman was telling about the witches' village. Sometimes there is a wicked woman in a village who wishes harm to everyone. Usually these women conceive no children. Sometimes one of these women is so wicked that the village will no longer let her stay. Then the villagers go to her hut at night, her husband is fettered, and the woman is beaten with switches and driven far out into the woods and swamps. She is cursed with a curse and left there. Soon the husband's fetters are removed, and if he is not too old, he can take himself another wife. But if the expelled woman does not die, she wanders about in the woods and swamps, learns the language of animals, and when she has roamed long enough, sooner or later she finds her way to a small village that is called the witches' village. There all the wicked women who have been driven from their villages have come together and made a village of their own. There they live, do their wickedness, and make magic. But especially because they have no children of their own, they like to coax children from the proper villages, and when a child is lost in the woods and never seen again, it may not have drowned in the swamp or been eaten by a wolf, but led astray by a witch and taken to the witches' village. In the days when I was still little and my grandmother was the eldest in the village, a girl once went to pick bilberries with the others, and while she was picking she grew tired and fell asleep. She was small, the ferns hid her from sight, and the other children moved on and did not notice until they were back in the village and it was already evening. Then they saw that the girl was no longer with them. The young men were sent out. They searched and called in the woods until night fell, and then they came back and had not found her. But the little girl, after she had slept enough, went on and on in the woods, and the more frightened she became, the faster she ran. But she no longer had any idea where she was, and only ran farther away from the village, deeper and deeper into wild country. Around her neck, on a strip of bast, she wore a boar's tooth that her father had given her. He had brought it back from the hunt, and with a stone tool bored a hole through the tooth so that the bast could be drawn through it, and before that he had boiled the tooth 3 times in boar's blood and sung good spells, and anyone who wore such a tooth was protected against many kinds of magic. Now a woman appeared from among the trees. She was a witch. She put on a kindly face and said, "Greetings, pretty child. Have you lost your way? Come along with me. I'll take you home." The child went along. But she remembered what her mother and father had told her, that she should never let a stranger see the boar's tooth, and so while she walked, she slipped the tooth off the strip of bast and tucked it into her belt without being noticed. The woman walked for hours with the girl. It was already night when they reached the village, but it was not our village. It was the witch's village. There the girl was locked up in a dark stable, but the witch went to sleep in her hut. In the morning the witch said, "Don't you have a boar's tooth with you?" The child said no, she had had one, but she had lost it in the woods, and she showed her necklace with the tooth missing from it. Then the witch took a clay pot filled with earth, and 3 plants were growing in the earth. The child looked at the plants and asked what they were. The witch pointed to the first plant and said, "That is your mother's life." Then she pointed to the second and said, "That is your father's life." Then she pointed to the third plant, "And that is your own life. As long as the plants are green and growing, you are all alive and well. If one withers, then the one whose life it is falls sick. If one is pulled out, as I am going to pull one out now, then the one whose life it is will surely die." She took hold of the plant that meant the father's life, and began tugging at it, and when she had pulled it out a little, so that a piece of the white root could be seen, the plant gave a deep sigh. At these words, the little girl beside Knecht sprang to her feet, as if she had been bitten by a snake, screamed, and ran headlong away. She had been sitting for a long time fighting back the terror caused by the story, until she could no longer endure it. One old woman laughed. Other listeners were almost as frightened as the little girl, but they controlled themselves and remained seated. But Knecht, startled out of his trance of fear, also sprang up and ran after the girl. The old woman went on with her story. The rainmaker had his hut close by the village pond, and Knecht looked for the runaway in this direction. He searched and tried to lure her out of hiding with coaxing, reassuring hums and sing-songs and clucks, using the voice that women use to call chickens, sweet, long-drawn-out notes intent on enchantment. "Ada," he called and sang. "Ada, little Ada, come here, Ada. Here I am, Knecht." He sang again and again, and before he had heard a sound from her or caught a glimpse of her, he suddenly felt her small, soft hand force its way into his. She had been standing by the path, pressed against the wall of a hut, and been waiting for him since hearing his first call. With a sigh of relief, she moved close to him. He seemed to her as tall and strong as a man. "Were you frightened?" he asked. "You shouldn't be. No one will hurt you. Everyone likes Ada. Come, we'll go home." She was still trembling and sobbing a little, but was already calmer, and went gratefully and trustfully along with him. Dim red light filtered through the doorway of the hut. Inside, the rainmaker sat stooped by the hearth. Yellow and red light gleamed through his flowing hair. The hearth fire was lit, and he was boiling something in 2 small pots. Before entering with Ada, Knecht watched curiously from outside for a few moments. He could see at once that whatever was being boiled was not food. That was done in different pots, and besides, it was already much too late to prepare a meal. But the rainmaker had already heard him. "Who is standing at the door?" he called out. "Step forward. Come in. Is it you, Ada?" He placed lids on his pots, raked glowing embers up against them, and turned around. Knecht was still peering at the mysterious little pots. He felt curiosity, awe, and a sense of oppression all at once, as he always did whenever he entered this hut. He came here as often as he could, made up all sorts of pretexts for coming, but once he was here he always felt this half-thrilling, half-warning sensation of slight uneasiness, of eager curiosity and pleasure warring with fear. The old man knew that Knecht had long been trailing after him, turning up as he did at odd moments and unlikely places. The boy was pursuing him like a hunter following a spoor, and mutely offering his services and his company. Turu, the rainmaker, looked at him with his bright hawk's eyes. "What are you doing here?" he asked coolly. "This is no time of day for visits to strange huts, my boy." "I've brought Ada home, Master Turu. She was listening to the mother tell stories about witches, and all of a sudden she was so frightened she screamed, so I walked her home." The rainmaker turned to his daughter. "You're too timid, Ada. Sensible little girls need not fear witches. You're a sensible little girl, aren't you?" "Yes, but the witches know all sorts of wicked tricks, and if you don't have a boar's tooth—" "I see you'd like to have a boar's tooth. All right. But I know something even better. A special root I'll give you. We'll look for it in the autumn. It protects sensible girls from all kinds of magic, and even makes them prettier." Ada smiled happily. She was already reassured, now that the smell of the hut and the familiar firelight surrounded her. Shyly, Knecht asked, "Couldn't I help look for the root? If you had only described the plant to me." Turu's eyes narrowed. "A good many little boys would like to know that," he said, but his voice did not sound angry, only slightly mocking. "There's time for that. Perhaps in the autumn." Knecht slipped away and went to the youth house where he slept. He had no parents. He was an orphan. For that reason, too, he was entranced by Ada and her hut. Turu, the rainmaker, was not fond of words. He did not like to hear himself or others talking. Many tribesmen thought him peculiar, and some sullen. But he was neither. He knew what was going on around him, or at any rate knew more than anyone would have expected in a man seemingly so solitary, absent-minded, and full of learning. Among other things, he knew quite well that this somewhat bothersome but handsome and evidently clever boy was running after him and observing him. He had noticed this as soon as it began, for it had been going on a year or longer now. He knew, too, exactly what it meant. It meant a great deal for the boy's future, and also meant a great deal for him, the rainmaker. It meant that this boy had fallen in love with rainmaking, and was longing to learn the art. Every so often there would be such boys in the village, and they would begin to hang about him, much as this boy was doing. Some could easily be discouraged and frightened away, others not, and he had taken on 2 of them as his disciples and apprentices. Both had married into other villages far away, and were the rainmakers or simples-gatherers there. Since then, Turu had been alone, and if he ever again took another apprentice, it would be to train him as his own successor. That was how it had always been. That was how it ought to be, and it could be no other way. A gifted boy always had to turn up and attach himself to the man whom he saw as the master of his craft. Knecht was talented. He had what was needed, and he also had several signs to commend him. Above all, the look in his eyes, at once piercing and dreamy, the reserve and quiet in his manner, and in the expression of his face and the carriage of his head, something questing, scenting, and alert, an attentiveness to noises and smells. There was something of the hawk and something of the hunter about him. Surely this boy could become a weather-maker, perhaps a magician also. He could be taught. But there was no hurry. The boy was still too young, and there was no reason to show him that he had been recognized. Apprenticeship must not be made too easy for him. He must go the whole way himself. If he could be intimidated, deterred, shaken off, discouraged, he would be no great loss. Let him wait and serve. Let him creep around and pay court. Knecht sauntered through the gathering night under a cloudy sky with 2 or 3 stars. He made his way into the village, content and happily excited. This village knew nothing of the luxuries, beauties, and refinements which we today take for granted, and which even the poorest among us regard as indispensable. The village had no culture and no arts. Its only buildings were the crooked mud huts. It knew nothing of iron and steel tools. Even wheat and wine were unknown. Inventions such as candles or lamps would have seemed dazzling wonders to these people. But Knecht's life and the world of his imagination were no poorer on that account. The world surrounded him like a picture book full of inexhaustible mysteries. Every day he conquered another little piece of it, from the animal and plant life to the starry sky, and between mute, mysterious nature and the breathing soul in his solitary, nervous, boyish frame, there dwelt all the kinship and all the tension, anxiety, curiosity, and craving for understanding of which the human soul is capable. Although there was no written knowledge in his world, no history, no books, no alphabets, and although everything that lay more than 3 or 4 hours' walk beyond his village was totally unknown and unreachable, he nevertheless lived fully and completely in his village, in the things that were his. The village, home, the community of the tribe under the guidance of the mothers gave him everything that nation and state can give to man, a soil filled with thousands of roots among whose intricate network he himself was a fiber, sharing in the life of all. Contentedly he sauntered along. The night wind whispered in the trees. Branches creaked. There were smells of moist earth, of reeds and mud, of the smoke of wood still partly green, an oily and sweetish smell that meant home more than any other, and finally, as he approached the youth hut, there was its smell, the smell of boys, of young men's bodies. Noiselessly he ducked under the reed mat into the warm, breathing darkness. He settled into the straw and thought about the story of the witches, the boar's tooth, Ada, the rainmaker, and his little pots in the fire, until he fell asleep. Turu only grudgingly yielded to the boy's importunity. He did not make it easy for him. But the youth was always on his trail. Something drew him to the old man, though he himself often did not know what it was. Sometimes, when the rainmaker was off somewhere in a remote spot in the woods, swamp, or heath, setting a trap, sniffing the spoor of an animal, digging a root, or collecting seeds, he would suddenly feel the boy's eyes upon him. Invisible, making no sound, Knecht had been following him for hours, watching his every move. Sometimes the rainmaker would pretend not to notice. Sometimes he growled and ungraciously ordered the boy to make himself scarce. But sometimes he would beckon him and let him stay for the day, would assign him tasks, show him one thing and another, give him advice, set tests for him, tell him the names of plants, order him to draw water or kindle fires. For each of these procedures he knew special tricks, knacks, secrets, and formulas, which must, he impressed this on the boy, be kept strictly secret. And finally, when Knecht was somewhat older, he took him from the youth house into his own hut, thus acknowledging the boy as his apprentice. By that act Knecht was distinguished before all the people. He was no longer one boy among others. He was the rainmaker's apprentice, and that meant that if he bore up and amounted to something, he would be the next rainmaker. From the moment the old man took Knecht into his hut, the barriers between them dropped, not the barrier of veneration and obedience, but of distrust and constraint. Turu had submitted. He had allowed Knecht to conquer him by tenacious courtship. Now he wanted nothing more than to make a good rainmaker and successor of the boy. In this course of instruction there were no concepts, doctrines, methods, script, figures, and only very few words. The master trained Knecht's senses far more than his intellect. A great heritage of tradition and experience, the sum total of man's knowledge of nature at that era, had to be administered, employed, and even more passed on. A vast and dense system of experiences, observations, instincts, and habits of investigation was slowly and hazily laid bare to the boy. Scarcely any of it was put into concepts. Virtually all of it had to be grasped, learned, tested with the senses. The basis and heart of this science was knowledge of the moon, of its phases and effects as it waxed and waned, peopled by the souls of the dead, whom it sent forth into new births in order to make room for the newly dead. Like that evening when he had escorted the frightened Ada to her father's hearth, another time was deeply etched on Knecht's memory. This was a time when the master woke him 2 hours after midnight and went out with him in deep darkness to show him the last rising of a vanishing crescent moon. The master in motionless silence, the boy somewhat tremulous, shivering from lack of sleep, they waited a long time on a ledge of rock in the midst of the forested hills, watching the spot indicated by the master, until the thin, gently curving line of the moon appeared in the very position and shape he had described beforehand. Fearful and fascinated, Knecht stared at the slowly rising heavenly body. Gently it floated between dark banks of clouds in an island of clear sky. "Soon it will change its shape and wax again, and then will come the time to sow the buckwheat," the rainmaker said, counting out the days on his fingers. Then he lapsed into silence again. Knecht crouched as if he were alone on the rock gleaming with dew. He trembled with cold. From the depths of the forest came the long-drawn call of an owl. The old man pondered for a long while. Then he rose, placed his hand on Knecht's hair, and said softly, as if awakening from a dream, "When I die, my spirit will fly into the moon. By then you will be a man and need a wife. My daughter Ada will be your wife. When she has a son by you, my spirit will return and dwell in your son, and you will call him Turu, as I am called Turu." The apprentice heard all this in astonishment. He did not dare say a word. The thin silvery sickle rose and was already half devoured by the clouds. A strange tremor passed through the young man, an intimation of many links and associations, repetitions and cross-currents among things and events. He felt strangely poised, both as spectator and participant, against this alien night sky, where the thin, sharp crescent, precisely predicted by the master, had appeared above endless woods and hills. How wonderful the master seemed, and veiled in 1,000 secrets. He who could think of his own death, whose spirit would live in the moon and return from the moon back into a person who would be Knecht's son and bear the former master's name. The future, the fate before him, seemed strangely torn asunder, in places transparent as the cloudy sky, and the fact that anyone could know it, define it, and speak of it, seemed to throw open a view into incalculable spaces, full of wonders, and yet also full of orderliness. For a moment it seemed to him that the mind could grasp everything, know everything, hear the secrets of everything, the soft, sure course of the planets above, the life of man and animals, their bonds and hostilities, meetings and struggles, everything great and small, along with the death locked within each living being. He saw or felt all this as a whole in a first shudder of premonition, and himself fitted into it, included within it, as part of the orderliness, governed by laws accessible to the mind. This first inkling of the great mysteries, their dignity and death as well as their knowability, came to the young man in the coolness of the forest as night moved toward morning and he crouched on the rock above the multitude of whispering treetops. It came to him, touched him like a ghostly hand. He could not speak of it, not then and never in his whole life, but he could not help thinking of it many times. In all his further learning and experiencing, the intensity of this hour was present in his mind. "Think of it," it reminded him. "Think that all this exists, that there are rays and currents between the moon and you and Turu and Ada, that there is death and the land of the souls and a returning therefrom, and that in your heart there is an answer to all the things and sights of the world, that everything concerns you, that you ought to know as much about everything as it is possible for man to know." Something like this was what the voice said. For Knecht, this was the first time he heard the inner voice speaking thus, heard the seductive and imperative bidding of man's spirit. He had seen many a moon wander across the sky, and heard many a nocturnal owl shrieking, and laconic though the master was, he had heard many a word of ancient wisdom or of solitary reflection from his lips. But at this moment something new and different had struck him. Presentiment of wholeness, the feeling for connections and relations, for the order that included him and gave him a share in the responsibility for everything. If you had the key to that, you did not need to depend on footprints to recognize an animal, or roots or seeds to know a plant. You would be able to grasp the whole world, stars, spirits, men, animals, medicines, and poisons, to grasp everything in its wholeness, and to discern in every part and sign every other part. There were good hunters who could read more than others in a track, in fumets, in a patch of fur and remains. They could say from a few tiny hairs not only what kind of animal these came from, but also whether it was old or young, male or female. From the shape of a cloud, a smell in the air, the peculiar behavior of animals or plants, others could foretell the weather for days in advance. His master was unsurpassed in this art, and nearly infallible. Still others had an inborn skill. There were boys who could hit a bird with a stone at 30 paces. They had not learned it. They could simply do it. It did not come by effort, but by magic or grace. The stone in their hand flew off by itself. The stone wanted to hit, and the bird wanted to be hit. There were said to be others who knew the future, whether a sick man would live or die, whether a pregnant woman would give birth to a boy or a girl. The tribal mother's daughter was famous for this, and the rainmaker, too, was said to possess some of this knowledge. There must, it seemed to Knecht at this moment, be a center in the vast net of associations. If you were at this center, you could know everything, could see all that had been and all that was to come. Knowledge must pour in upon one who stood at this center, as water ran to the valley and the hare to the cabbage. His word would strike sharply and infallibly as the stone in the sharpshooter's hand. By virtue of the mind's power, he would unite all these wonderful gifts and abilities within himself and use them at will. He would be the perfect, wise, insurpassable man. To become like him, to draw nearer to him, to be on the way to him. That was the way of ways, that was the goal that gave sacredness and meaning to a life. Something like this was the way he felt, and our attempts to speak of it in our conceptual language, which he could never know, convey nothing of the awe and the passion of his experience. Rising at night, being led through the dark, still woods full of dangers and mysteries, waiting on the ledge in the chill of night and early morning, the appearance of the thin phantom of a moon, the wise master's few words, being alone with the master at so extraordinary an hour, all this was experienced and preserved by Knecht as a solemn mystery, as a solemn initiation, as his admission into a league and a cult, into a humble but honorable relationship to the unnameable, the cosmic mystery. This and many another similar experience could not be put into thoughts, let alone words. Even more remote from his way of thinking, even more impossible than any other thought, would have been words such as this: "Is it only I alone who have created this experience, or is it objective reality? Does the master have the same feelings as I, or would mine amuse him? Are my thoughts new, unique, my own, or have the master and many before him experienced and thought exactly the same?" No, for him there were no such analyses and differentiations. Everything was reality, was steeped in reality, full of it as bread dough is of yeast. The clouds, the moon, and the shifting scenes in the theater of the sky, the cold wet limestone under his bare feet, the damp, trickling cold dew in the pallid night air, the comforting home-like smell of hearth smoke and bed of leaves suffusing the skin the master had slung around him, the dignity and the faint note of old age and readiness for death in his rough voice, all that was beyond reality and penetrated almost violently into the boy's senses. And sense impressions are a deeper soil for growing memories than the best systems and analytical methods. Although the rainmaker was one of the few members of the tribe who had an occupation, who had developed a special art and ability, his everyday life outwardly did not differ greatly from that of the other members of the tribe. He was an important man with considerable prestige. He also received payment from the tribe whenever he had to do some service for the community, but this happened only on special occasions. By far his most important and sacred function came in the spring, when he determined the proper day for sowing every kind of fruit and plant. He did this by carefully considering the state of the moon, partly by handed-down rules, partly by his own experience. But the solemn act of opening the season of seeding, the strewing of the first handful of grain and seeds on the community land, was no longer part of his office. That task was too high for any mere man. It was performed every year by the tribal mother herself, or by her oldest female relative. The master became the principal person in the village only when he really had to function as weather-maker. This happened when a long drought or a long spell of damp and cold struck the fields and threatened the tribe with famine. Then Turu had to apply the methods effective against drought and poor crops: sacrifices, exorcisms, processions. According to legend, in cases of obstinate drought or endless rain, when all other means failed and the spirits could not be moved by persuasion, pleas, or threats, there was a last infallible method used in the days of the mothers and grandmothers: sacrifice of the weather-maker himself by the community. The tribal mother, it was said, had witnessed one such sacrifice. Aside from looking after the weather, the master also had a kind of private practice as an exorcist, as a maker of amulets and charms, and in some cases as a doctor, wherever medical matters were not reserved to the tribal mother. But for the rest, Master Turu lived the life of every other tribesman. He helped to till the common land when his turn came, and also had his own small garden near the hut. He gathered and stored fruit, mushrooms, and firewood. He hunted and fished, and kept a goat or two. As a farmer he was like all the others, but as a hunter, fisherman, and herb-gatherer, he was not like anyone else. Rather, he was a solitary genius, with a reputation for knowing a great many natural and magical tricks, devices, knacks, and aids. It was said he could weave a willow noose which no animal could escape. He had special recipes for fish bait. He knew how to lure crayfish, and there were some who thought that he understood the language of many a beast. But his real specialty was more arcane: observation of the moon and the stars, knowledge of the weather signs, ability to forecast weather and growth, and a command of many magical effects. Thus he was a great collector of plant and animal materials, efficacious for remedies and poisons, for working magic, for conferring blessings, and for fending off dangerous spirits. He knew where to find even the rarest plants. He knew when they blossomed and ripened seed, and the right time to dig their roots. He knew where to find all kinds of snakes and toads, knew how to use horns, hoofs, claws, hair. He knew what to do with growths, deformities, weird and horrible excrescences, knots, tumors, burls, and scales, of wood, of leaves, of grain, of nuts, of horns and hoofs. Knecht had more to learn with his feet and hands, his eyes, skin, ears, and nose, than with his intellect, and Turu taught far more by example and by dumb show than by words and prescription. The master rarely spoke coherently, and even when he did, his words were only a supplement to his singularly impressive gestures. Knecht's apprenticeship differed little from the apprenticeship a young hunter or fisherman undergoes with a good master, and it gave him great pleasure, for he learned only the things that were already latent within him. He learned to lie in wait, to listen, to stalk, to watch, to be on his guard, to be alert, to spy and sense. But the game that he and his master stalked was not only fox and badger, otter and toad, bird and fish, but essence, the whole, meaning, relationship. They sought to determine, to recognize, to guess and forecast the fleeting, unstable weather, to know the death lying hidden in a berry or snakebite, to eavesdrop on the secret relations between clouds or storms and the phases of the moon, relations that affected the growth of crops as they did the haleness or doom of man and beast. No doubt they were really seeking the same ends as the science and technology of later centuries: dominance over nature and a control over her laws, but they went about it in an entirely different way. They did not stand off from nature and try to penetrate into her secrets by violence. They were never opposed and hostile to nature, but always part of her and reverently devoted to her. It is quite likely that they knew her better and dealt more wisely with her. But one thing was utterly impossible for them. Not even in their most audacious moments would it have occurred to them to meet nature and the world of spirits without fear, let alone to feel superior to them. Such hubris was unthinkable. They could not have imagined having any other attitude but fear toward the forces of nature, toward death and the demons. Fear loomed over the life of man. It could not be overcome. But it could be pacified, outwitted, masked, brought within bounds, placed within the orderly framework of life as a whole. The various systems of sacrifices served this purpose. Fear was the permanent pressure upon the lives of these people, and without this high pressure their life would have lacked stress, of course, but also lacked intensity. A man who had been able to ennoble his fear by transforming part of it into awe had gained a great deal. People of this sort, people whose fear had become a form of piety, were the good men and the progressive men of that age. There were many sacrifices and many kinds of sacrifice, and a certain portion of these sacrifices, with their accompanying rites, fell within the province of the weather-maker. Alongside Knecht in the hut, little Ada grew up, a pretty child, the old man's darling. And when he thought the time had come, he gave her to his disciple for a wife. From this point on, Knecht was considered the rainmaker's assistant. Turu presented him to the village mother as his son-in-law and successor, and thereafter allowed him to carry out many official acts and functions as his deputy. Gradually, as the seasons and years passed, the old rainmaker lapsed into the solitary meditativeness of age and left all his duties to Knecht. By the time the old man was found dead, crouched over some small pots of magic brew on the hearth, his white hair singed by the fire, the boy, the disciple Knecht, had long been familiar to the village as the rainmaker. He demanded that the village council provide an impressive funeral for his teacher, and as a sacrifice burned a whole heap of precious medicinal herbs and roots over the grave. That, too, had happened long ago, and several of Knecht's children already crowded Ada's hut, among them a boy named Turu. In him the old man had returned from his death flight to the moon. Knecht fared much as had his teacher in times past. Part of his fear was transformed into piety and thought. Part of his youthful aspiration and his profound longings remained alive. Part faded away and evaporated as he grew older in his work, in his love and solicitude for Ada and the children. His foremost passion was still for the moon and its influence upon the seasons and the weather. To this he devoted persistent study, and in knowledge of these matters he reached and ultimately surpassed his master Turu. And because the waxing and waning of the moon are so closely bound up with the birth and death of men, because of all the fears in which men live, fear of having to die is the strongest, Knecht acquired from his adoration and knowledge of the moon a devout and purified attitude toward death. In his riper years he was less subject to the fear of death than other men. He could speak reverently with the moon, or supplicatingly or tenderly. He knew that he was linked to it by delicate spiritual bonds. He knew the moon's life with great precision, shared with all the force of his own soul in the episodes of the moon's destiny. He experienced its disappearance and rebirth like a mystery within himself, suffered with it, felt alarm when the dreaded event occurred and the moon seemed exposed to illness and dangers, change and harm, when it lost its brightness, changed color, darkened until it seemed on the verge of extinction. At such times, it was true, everyone sympathized with the moon, trembled for it, recognized menace and the imminence of disaster in its eclipse, and stared anxiously at its old ravaged face. But precisely at such times, Rainmaker Knecht showed that he was closer to the moon and knew more about it than others. For although he shared in its suffering, although his heart constricted with anxiety, his memory of similar experiences was keener, his confidence better founded. He had greater faith in eternity and a second coming, in the possibility of revising and conquering death. Greater, too, was the degree of his devotion. At such times he felt in himself a readiness to share the fate of the celestial orb to the point of doom and rebirth. At times he even felt something akin to temerity, a kind of rash courage and the resolution to defy death by the power of mind, to strengthen his own selfhood by surrender to superhuman destinies. Some trace of this was apparent in his manner. Others sensed it and regarded him as knowing and devout, a man of great calm and little fear of death, one who stood well with the higher powers. He had to prove these gifts and virtues in many hard tests. Once he had to withstand a period of poor crops and adverse weather that extended over 2 years. It was the greatest trial of his life. Troubles and bad portents had begun with the repeatedly postponed sowing, and then every imaginable misfortune had affected the crops, until in the end they were virtually destroyed. The village had starved cruelly, and Knecht, the rainmaker, with it. It was a considerable achievement in itself to have survived this bitter year without losing all credence and standing, so that he could still help the tribe bear the catastrophe with humility and some degree of composure. When the next year, after a hard winter in which many of the tribe perished, all the miseries of the preceding year were repeated, when during the summer the common land parched and cracked in a stubborn drought, the mice multiplied fearfully, and the solitary conjurations and sacrifices of the rainmaker proved as vain as the public ceremonies, the drum choruses, and the processions of the whole community, when evidence mounted that this time the rainmaker could not make rain, it was no small matter, and more than ordinary strength was needed to bear the responsibility and hold up his head against the frightened and infuriated people. There were 2 or 3 weeks in which Knecht stood entirely alone, confronting the entire village, confronting hunger and despair, confronting the ancient belief among the people that only sacrifice of the weather-maker could propitiate the powers. He had won the victory by yielding. He had not opposed the idea, had offered himself as the sacrifice. Moreover, with enormous toil and devotion, he had helped to alleviate distress, had repeatedly discovered sources of water, divining a spring here, a trickling stream there. Even in a time of greatest distress, he had not allowed the villagers to slaughter all their livestock. Above all, he had lent his support to the tribal mother, who had succumbed to fatalism and weakness in these difficult times. By advice, threat, magic, and prayer, by example and intimidation, he saved her from collapsing completely and letting everything drift wildly. In those times of calamity and universal anxiety, it became apparent that a man is the more useful, the more his life and thinking is turned toward matters of the spirit, matters that go beyond the personal realm, the more he has learned to venerate, observe, worship, serve, and sacrifice. The 2 terrible years, which had almost cost him his life, ended with his being more highly regarded and trusted than ever, not by the thoughtless crowd, of course, but by the few who bore responsibility and were able to judge a man of his type. His life had passed through these and many other trials by the time he reached the best years of his maturity. He had officiated over the burial of 2 of the tribal mothers, had lost a charming 6-year-old son who had been carried off by a wolf. He had survived a severe illness without outside help, acting as his own physician. He had suffered hunger and cold. All this had marked his face, and his soul no less. He had also made the discovery that, in a certain peculiar manner, men of thought gave offense and aroused the repugnance of their fellows. They might be valued at a distance and called on in emergencies, but others neither love them nor accept them, rather give them a wide berth. He had also learned that the sick and unfortunate are far more receptive to traditional magic spells and exorcisms than to sensible advice, that people more readily accept affliction and outward penances than the task of changing themselves, or even examining themselves, that they believe more easily in magic than reason, in formulas than experience. These are matters which, in the several thousand years since his era, have probably not changed so much as a good many history books claim. But he had also learned that a seeking, thoughtful man dare not forfeit love, that he must meet the wishes and follies of men halfway, not showing arrogance, but also not truckling to them, that it is always only a single step from sage to charlatan, from priest to mountebank, from helpful brother to parasitic drone, and that the people would by far prefer to pay a swindler and be exploited by a quack than accept help given freely and unselfishly. They would much rather pay in money and goods than in trust and love. They cheat one another and expect to be cheated themselves. You had to learn to see man as a weak, selfish, and cowardly creature. You also had to realize how many of these evil traits and impulses you shared yourself, and nevertheless you allowed yourself to believe, and nourished your soul on the faith that man is also spirit and love, that something dwells in him which is at variance with his instincts and longs to refine them. But all these thoughts are no doubt far too abstract and explicit for Knecht to have been capable of them. Let us say he was on the way to them. His way would some day lead him to them and past them. While he went his way, longing for abstract thought, but living far more in the senses, in the spell of the moon, in the pungency of an herb, the saltiness of a root, the taste of a piece of bark, in cultivating simples, blending salves, submitting to the whims of weather and atmosphere, he developed many abilities within himself, including some that we of a later generation no longer possess and only half understand. The most important of these abilities was, of course, rainmaking. Although there were a good many special times when the sky stayed obdurate and seemed to mock his efforts, Knecht nevertheless made rain hundreds of times, and almost every time in a slightly different way. He would, of course, never have dared to make the slightest change or omission in the sacrifices and the rite of processions, conjurations, and drumming. But that was only the official, the public part of his work, the priestly side, which was for show, and undoubtedly it was very fine and produced a fine exalted feeling when, after a day of sacrifices and processions, the sky gave way in the evening, the horizon clouded over, the wind began to smell damp, the first drops of rain splattered down. But it had taken the weather-maker's art to choose the day well, not to strive blindly when the prospects were poor. You could implore the powers, even besiege them, but you had to do so with feeling and moderation, with submission to their will. Even more than those glorious, triumphant experiences of felicitous intercession, he preferred certain others that no one but himself knew about, and even he knew about them only timorously, more with his senses than his understanding. There were weather conditions, tensions of the atmosphere and of heat, cloud formations and winds, smells of water and earth and dust, threats and promises, moods and whims of the weather demons, which Knecht detected in advance with his skin, his hair, with all his senses, so that he could not be surprised by anything, could not be disappointed. He concentrated the very vibrations of the weather within himself, holding them within him in such a way that he could command the clouds and the winds, not to be sure just as he pleased, but out of the very intimacy and attachment he had with them, which totally erased the difference between him and the world, between inside and outside. At such times he could stand rapt, listening, or crouch rapt, with all his pores open, and not only feel the life of the winds and clouds within his own self, but also direct and engender it, somewhat in the way we can awaken and reproduce within ourselves a phrase of music that we know by heart. Then he needed only to hold his breath, and the wind or the thunder stopped. He needed only to nod or shake his head, and the hail pelted down or ceased. He needed only to express by a smile the balance of the conflicting forces within himself, and the billows of clouds would part, revealing the thin, bright blueness. There were many times of unusually pure harmony and composure in his soul when he carried the weather of the next few days within himself with infallible foreknowledge, as if the whole score were already written in his blood in such a way that the outside world must play every note exactly as it stood. Those were his best days, his reward, his delight. But when this intimate connection with the outside was broken, when the weather and the world were unfamiliar, incomprehensible, and unpredictable, then currents were interrupted and derangements occurred within him. Then he felt that he was not a real rainmaker, that his responsibility for weather and crops was an error and nuisance. At such times he was domestic, behaved obediently and helpfully toward Ada, sedulously shared the household tasks with her, made toys and tools for the children, pottered about preparing medicines, craved love, and wanted nothing better than to differ as little as possible from other men, to conform wholly to them in customs and morals, and even to listen to the otherwise vexatious gossip of his wife and the neighboring women about the life, health, and conduct of others. But in good times his family saw little of him, for then he roamed, fished, hunted, searched for roots, lay in the grass or crouched in trees, sniffed, listened, imitated the voices of animals, kindled little fires and compared the shapes of the smoke clouds with the clouds in the sky, drenched his skin and hair with fog, rain, air, sun, or moonlight, and incidentally gathered, as his master and predecessor Turu had done in his lifetime, objects whose inner character and outward form seemed to belong to different realms, in which the wisdom or whimsicality of nature seemed to reveal some fragment of her rules and secrets of creation, objects which seemed to unite symbolically widely disparate ideas, gnarled branches with the faces of men or animals, water-polished pebbles grained like wood, petrified animals of the primordial world, misshapen or twinned fruit pits, stones shaped like kidneys or hearts. He read the veinings of a leaf, the pattern on a mushroom cap, and divined mysteries, relations, futures, possibilities. The magic of symbols, the foreshadowing of numbers and writing, the reduction of infinitudes and multiplicities to simplicity, to system, to concept. For all these ways of comprehending the world through the mind no doubt lay within him, nameless, unnamed, but not inconceivable, not beyond the bounds of presentiment, still in the germ, but essential to his nature, part of him, growing organically within him. And if we were to go still further back beyond this rainmaker and his time, which to us seems so early and primitive, if we were to go several thousands of years further back into the past, wherever we found man, we would still find, this is our firm belief, the mind of man. That mind which has no beginning, and always has contained everything that it later produces. The weather-maker was not destined to win immortality by any one of his premonitions, or to come any closer to proving their validity. For him, indeed, they scarcely needed proof. He did not become one of the many inventors of writing, nor of geometry, nor of medicine or astronomy. He remained an unknown link in the chain, but a link as indispensable as any other. He passed on what he had received, and he added what he had newly acquired by his own struggles. For he, too, had disciples. In the course of the years he trained 2 apprentices to be rainmakers, one of whom was later to become his successor. For long years he had gone about his affairs and practiced his craft alone and unobserved. Then, shortly after a great crop failure and time of famine, a boy started appearing, watching him, spying on him, adoring him, and generally skulking about. One who was drawn to rain-making and the master. With a strange, sorrowful tug at his heart, he sensed the recurrence and reversal of the great experience of his youth, and at the same time had that austere feeling, at once constricting and stirring, that afternoon had set in, that youth was gone and noonday past, that the blossom had become a fruit. And to his own surprise, he behaved toward the boy exactly as old Turu had once behaved toward him. The stiff rebuff, the delaying wait-and-see attitude came of its own accord. It was neither an imitation of his deceased master, nor did it spring from moralistic and pedagogic considerations that a young man must be tested for a long time to see whether he is serious enough, that initiation into mystery should not be made easy, and similar theories. On the contrary, Knecht simply behaved toward his apprentices the way every somewhat aging, solitary, and learned eccentric behaves toward admirers and disciples. He was embarrassed, shy, distant, ready for flight, fearful for his lovely solitude and his freedom to roam in the wilderness, to go hunting and collecting alone, to dream and listen. He was full of a jealous love for all his habits and hobbies, his secrets and meditations. There could be no question of his embracing the timid youth who approached him with worshipful curiosity, no question of helping him overcome this timidity by encouraging him, no question of his rejoicing and having a sense of reward, appreciation, and pleasant success, because the world of the others was at last sending him an emissary and a declaration of love, because someone was courting him, someone felt drawn to him, and like himself called to the service of mysteries. On the contrary, at first he felt it merely as a troublesome disturbance. infringement on his rights and habits, loss of his independence. For the first time he realized how much he prized that independence. He resisted the wooing and became clever at outwitting the boy and hiding himself, at covering his tracks, evading and escaping. But what had happened to Turu now happened to him also. The boy's long, mute courtship slowly softened his heart, slowly, slowly wore down his resistance, so that the more the boy gained ground, the more Knecht learned to turn to him and open his mind to him, approve his longing, accept his courtship, and eventually come to regard the new and often vexatious duty of teaching and having a disciple as inevitable, imposed by fate, one of the requirements of a life of thought. More and more he had to bid farewell to the dream, the feeling and the pleasure of infinite potentialities, of a multiplicity of futures. Instead of the dream of unending progress, of the sum of all wisdom, his pupil stood by, a small, near, demanding reality, an intruder and nuisance, but no longer to be rebuffed or evaded. For the boy represented, after all, the only way into the real future, the one most important duty, the one narrow path along which the rainmaker's life and acts, principles, thoughts, and glimmerings could be saved from death and continue their life in a small new bud. Sighing, gnashing his teeth, and smiling, he accepted the burden. But even in this important, perhaps most responsible aspect of his work, the passing on of tradition and the education of successors, the weather-maker was not spared bitter disillusionment. The first apprentice who sued for his favor was named Morrow, and when, after long delay and every form of deterrence, he accepted the boy, Morrow disappointed him in a way he could never quite reconcile himself to. The boy was obsequious and wheedling, and for a long time pretended unconditional obedience, but he had certain faults. Above all, he lacked courage. He was especially afraid of night and darkness, a fact he tried to hide. Knecht, when he noticed it at last, continued for a long time to regard it as lingering childishness, which would eventually disappear. But it did not disappear. This disciple also completely lacked the gift of selfless devotion to observation for its own sake, to the procedures and processes of the rainmaker's work, and to ideas and speculations. He was clever, had a quick, bright mind, and he learned easily and surely whatever could be learned without surrender of the self. But it became more and more apparent that he had self-seeking aims, and that it was for the sake of these that he wanted to learn rainmaking. Above all, he wanted status. He wanted to count for something and make an impression. He had the vanity of talent, but not of vocation. He longed for applause. As soon as he acquired some scraps of knowledge and a few tricks, he showed off to his fellows. This, too, could be considered childish and might be outgrown. But he wanted more than applause. He also strove for power and advantages over others. When the master first began to notice this, he was alarmed and gradually withdrew his favor from the young man. Morrow had been an apprentice for some years when Knecht caught him in serious misdemeanors. One time he was induced, in return for presents, to treat a sick child with medicines without his master's knowledge and authorization. Another time he undertook on his own to rid a hut of rats by reciting spells, and when, in spite of all his master's warnings and his own pledges, he was caught again in similar practices, the master dismissed him, informed the tribal mother of the affair, and tried to banish the ungrateful and useless young man from his memory. His two later disciples compensated him for this disappointment, especially the second, who is his own son, Turu. He deeply loved this youngest and last of his apprentices, and believed the boy could become greater than himself. Plainly, his grandfather's spirit had returned in him. Knecht experienced the invigorating satisfaction of having passed on the sum of his knowledge and belief to the future, and of having a person who was his son twice over, to whom he could hand over his duties any time these became too heavy for him. But still that ill-favored first disciple could not be dismissed from his life and thoughts. In the village, Morrow became a man who, while not especially enjoying high honor, was nevertheless extremely popular and wielded considerable influence. He had taken a wife, amused many people by his talents as a kind of mountebank and jester, and had even become chief drummer in the drum corps. He remained a secret enemy of the rainmaker, consumed by envy and inflicting large and small injuries upon him whenever he could. Knecht had never had a gift for friendship and gregariousness. He needed solitude and freedom. He had never sought out respect or love, except for the time he was a boy seeking to win over Master Turu. But now he learned how it felt to have an enemy, someone who hated him. It spoiled a good many of his days. Morrow had been one of those highly talented pupils who, in spite of their talent, are always unpleasant and a grief to their teachers, because their talent has not grown from below and from within. It is not founded on organic strength, the delicate, ennobling mark of a good endowment, of sound blood and a sound character, but is in a curious way something adventitious, accidental, perhaps even usurped or stolen. A pupil of meager character but high intelligence or sparkling imagination invariably embarrasses the teacher. He is obliged to transmit to this pupil the knowledge and methodology he himself has inherited, and to prepare him for the life of the mind, and yet he cannot help feeling that his real and higher duty should be to protect the arts and sciences against the intrusion of young men who have nothing but talent. For the teacher is not supposed to serve the pupil, rather both are the servants of their culture. This is the reason teachers feel slightly repelled by certain glittering talents. A pupil of that type falsifies the whole meaning of pedagogy as service. All the help given to a pupil who can shine but cannot serve basically means doing harm to service, and is, in a way, a betrayal of culture. We know of periods in the history of many nations in which profound upheavals in cultural processes led to a surge of the merely talented into leading positions in communities, schools, academies, and governments. Highly talented people sat in all sorts of posts, but they were people who wanted to rule without being able to serve. Certainly it is often very difficult to recognize such people in good time before they have entrenched themselves in the intellectual professions. It is equally difficult to treat them with the necessary ruthlessness and send them back to other occupations. Knecht, too, had made mistakes. He had been patient far too long with his apprentice Morrow. He had entrusted esoteric knowledge to a superficial climber. That was a pity, and the consequences for himself were far graver than he could ever have foreseen. A year came, by then Knecht's beard was already quite gray, in which the orderly relationships between heaven and earth seemed to have been distorted by demons of unusual strength and malevolence. These distortions began in the autumn, with events of such fearful majesty that every soul in the village shook with terror. Shortly after the equinox, which the rainmaker always observed with heightened attentiveness and celebrated with solemnity and reverent worship, there was a display in the heavens that had not occurred within the memory of man. An evening came that was dry, windy, and rather cool. The sky was crystal clear except for a few restless small clouds which floated at a very great height, holding the rosy light of the setting sun for an unusually long time. They looked like loose and foamy bundles of light drifting in cold, pale cosmic space. For several days past, Knecht had sensed something that was stronger and more remarkable than the feeling he had every year at this time, when the days began growing shorter. A seething of the powers in the sky, a sense of alarm in earth, plants, and animals, a nervousness in the air, something inconstant, expectant, frightened, lowering in all of nature. The small clouds with their lingering, quivering flames formed part of the strangeness. Their fluttery movements did not correspond with the direction of the wind on the ground. After a long, sad struggle against extinction, their piteous red light grew cold and faded, and suddenly they were invisible. It was quiet in the village. The circle of children before the tribal mother's hut had long scattered. A few boys were still chasing about and tussling, but all the rest of the tribe were in their huts. Everyone had eaten. Many were already asleep. Scarcely anyone but the rainmaker observed the twilit clouds. Knecht walked back and forth in the small garden behind his hut, pondering the weather, tense and restive. At times he sat down for a brief rest on a stump that stood among the nettles and served him for splitting wood. As soon as the last glimmer of cloud was extinguished, the stars suddenly appeared against the greenish glow of the sky, and rapidly grew in number and brightness. Where there had been only 2 or 3 visible a moment before, there were now 10, 20. The rainmaker was familiar with many of them individually and in their groups and families. He had seen them many hundreds of times. There was always something reassuring about their unvarying reappearance. Stars were comforting. Though they hung so high, remote and cold, radiating no warmth, they were reliable, firmly aligned, proclaiming order, promising duration. Seemingly so aloof and far and opposed to life on earth, seemingly so untouched by the warmth, the writhings, the sufferings and ecstasies in the life of man, so superior in their cold majesty and eternity, that they seemed to make mock of human things, the stars nevertheless had a relation to us. They guided and governed us, perhaps, and if any human knowledge, any intellectual hold, any sureness and superiority of the mind over transitory things could be attained and retained, it would resemble the stars, shining like them in cool tranquillity, comforting with chilly shivers of awe, looking down eternally and somewhat mockingly. That was how they had often seemed to the rainmaker, and although he felt toward the stars nothing like the close, stimulating, constantly changing and recurring relationship he had toward the moon, the great, near, moist orb, the fat, magic fish in the sea of heaven, he nevertheless revered them and attached many beliefs to them. To gaze at them for a long time and allow their influence to work upon him, to expose his intelligence, his warmth, his anxiety to their serenely cold gaze, often laved and assuaged him like a healing draught. Tonight, too, they looked as they always did, except that they were very bright and seemed highly polished in the taut, thin air. But he could not find within himself the repose to surrender to them. From unknown realms, some power was tugging at him. It ached in his pores, sucked at his eyes, quietly and continually affected him. It was a current, a warning quiver. In the hut nearby, the warm, dim light of the hearth fire glimmered. Life flowed small and warm inside. A cry, a laugh, a yawn, human smells, skin warmth, motherhood, children's sleep. All that innocent presence seemed to deepen the night, to drive the stars still further back into the incomprehensible distances and heights. And now, while Knecht heard Ada's voice inside the hut, crooning and humming a low melody as she quieted a child, there began in the sky the calamity that the village would remember for many years. A flickering and glimmering appeared here and there in the still, glittering network of stars, as if the usually invisible threads of the net were suddenly leaping into flame. Like hurled stones, glowing and guttering, a few stars fell slantwise across the sky, 1 here, 2 there, a few more here, and before the eye had turned from the first vanished falling star, before the heart, stilled at the sight, had begun to beat again, the lights, falling or hurled at a slant or a slight arc across the sky, began to come in swarms of dozens, hundreds. A countless host, borne on a vast mute storm, they slanted across the silent night, as if a cosmic autumn were tearing all the stars like withered leaves from the tree of heaven and flinging them noiselessly into the void. Like withered leaves, like wafting snowflakes, they rushed away and down, thousands upon thousands, in fearful silence, vanishing beyond the wooded mountains to the southeast, where never a star had set since time immemorial. With frozen heart and swimming eyes, Knecht stood, head tilted back, gazing horrified but insatiably at the transformed and accursed sky, mistrusting his eyes, and yet only too certain of the direness of what they beheld. Like all who watched this nocturnal spectacle, he thought the familiar stars themselves were wavering, scattering and plunging down, and he expected that if the earth itself did not swallow him first, the firmament would soon appear black and emptied. After a while, however, he recognized what others could not know, that the well-known stars were still present, here and there and everywhere, that the frightful dispersion was taking place not among the old familiar stars, but in the space between earth and sky, and that these new lights, fallen or flung, so swiftly appearing and swiftly vanishing, glowed with a fire of another sort from the old, the proper stars. This was somewhat reassuring and helped him regain his balance. But even if these were new, transitory, different stars scattering through the air, still it meant disaster and disorder. Deep sighs came from Knecht's parched throat. He looked toward the earth. He listened to find out whether this uncanny spectacle were appearing to him alone, or whether others were also seeing it. Soon he heard groans, screams, and cries of terror from other huts. Others had seen it too. Their cries had alarmed the sleepers and the unaware. In a moment, panic had seized the entire village. With a sigh, Knecht took the burden on himself. This misfortune affected him, the rainmaker, above all others, for he was in a way responsible for order in the heavens. Always before he had known or sensed great catastrophes in advance, floods, hailstorms, tempests. Always he had warned the mothers and elders to be prepared. He had averted the worst evils. He had interposed himself, his knowledge, his courage, and his confidence in the powers above between the village and consternation. Why had he foreknown nothing this time, so that he could take no measure? Why had he said not a word to anyone of the obscure foreboding he had, after all, felt? He lifted the mat hung over the entrance of the hut and softly called his wife's name. She came, her youngest at her breast. He took the baby from her and laid it on the pallet. Holding Ada's hand, he placed a finger to his lips, enjoining silence, and led her out of the hut. He saw her patiently tranquil face grow distorted by terror.
"Let the children sleep. I don't want them to see this, do you hear?" he whispered intensely. "Don't let any of them come out, not even Turu, and you yourself stay inside."
He hesitated, uncertain how much to say, how many of his thoughts he ought to reveal. Finally he added firmly,
"Nothing will harm you and the children."
She believed him at once, although her face and her mind had not yet recovered from the fright.
"What is it?"
she asked, again staring at the sky.
"Is it very bad?"
"It is bad," he said gently.
"I think it may be very bad. But it doesn't concern you and the children. Stay in the hut, keep the mat drawn. I must talk to the people. Go in, Ada."
He pressed her through the opening, drew the mat carefully closed, and stood for the span of a few breaths with his face turned toward the continuing rain of stars. Then he bowed his head, sighed heavily once more, and walked swiftly through the night toward the tribal mother's hut. Half the village was already assembled there. A muted roar rose from them, a tumult half numbed by terror and choked by despair. There were women and men who surrendered with a kind of voluptuous rage to their sense of horror and impending doom. Some stood stiff, rapt. Others jerked about wildly with uncontrolled movements of their limbs. One woman was foaming at the mouth as she danced, alone, a despairing and obscene dance, at the same time pulling out whole handfuls of her long hair. Knecht realized that the effects were already at work. Almost all had succumbed to the intoxication. They were bewitched or driven mad by the falling stars, and an orgy of madness, fury, and self-destructiveness might follow. It was high time to collect the few brave and sensible members of the tribe and support their courage. The ancient tribal mother was calm. She believed that the end of all things had come, and that there was nothing to be done about it. Toward the inevitable, she showed a firm, hard face that looked almost mocking in its pinched astringency. He persuaded her to listen to him. He tried to show her that the old stars, the ones that had always been, were still in the sky. But she could not grasp it, either because her eyes no longer had the strength to discern them, or because her conception of the stars was too unlike the rainmaker's. She shook her head and maintained her courageous grin, but when Knecht implored her not to abandon the people to their terror, she instantly was of his mind. A small group of frightened but not yet maddened villagers, still willing to be led, formed around her and the weather-maker. Up to the moment he reached the group, Knecht had hoped to be able to check the panic by example, reason, speech, explanations, and encouragement. But his brief conversation with the tribal mother had shown him that it was too late for anything of the sort. He had hoped to let the others share in his own experience, to make them a gift of it. He had hoped to persuade them that the stars themselves were not falling, or not all of them, that no cosmic storm was sweeping them away. He had imagined that by such urging he would be able to move them from helpless dismay to active observation, so that they would be able to bear the shock. But he quickly saw that there were very few villagers who would hearken to him, and by the time he won them over, all the others would have utterly given way to madness. No, as was so often the case, reason and sensible speech could accomplish nothing here. Fortunately, there were other means. Although it was impossible to dispel their mortal terror by appeal to reason, this terror could still be guided, organized, given shape, so that the confusion of maddened people could be made into a solid unity, the wild single voices merged into a chorus. But there was no time to be lost. Knecht stepped before the people, loudly crying the well-known prayers that opened public ceremonies of penance and mourning, the lament for the death of a tribal mother, or the ceremony of sacrifice and atonement in the face of perils such as epidemics and floods. He shouted the words in rhythm and reinforced the rhythm by clapping his hands, and in the same rhythm, shouting and clapping his hands all the while, he stooped almost to the ground, straightened up, stooped again, and straightened up. Almost at once, 10 or 20 others joined in his movements. The white-haired mother of the village murmured in the same rhythm, and with tiny bows sketched the ritual movements. Those who were still flocking to the assemblage from the huts at once joined in the beat and the spirit of the ceremony. The few who had gone off their heads collapsed exhausted and lay motionless, or else were caught up in the murmur of the chorus and the religious genuflections. His method was effective. Instead of a demoralized horde of madmen, there now stood a reverent populace prepared for sacrifice and penance, each one benefiting, each one encouraged by now having to lock his horror and fear of death within himself, or bellow it crazily for himself alone. Each now fitted into his place in the orderly chorus of the multitude, keeping to the rhythm of the exorcistic ceremony. Many mysterious powers are present in such a rite. Its greatest comfort is its uniformity, confirming the sense of community, its infallible medicine, meter and order, rhythm and music. While the whole night sky was still covered by the host of falling stars like a rushing, silent cascade consisting of droplets of light, for another 2 hours it went on squandering its great red globules of fire, the horror in the village changed to submission and devotion, to prayers to the powers and penitential feelings. In their fear and weakness, men met the disorder of the sky with order and religious concord. Even before the rain of stars began to slacken, the miracle had taken place. The inner miracle radiated healing powers, and by the time the sky seemed slowly to be quieting down and recovering, all the dead-tired penitents had the redeeming feeling that their worship had placated the powers and restored order in the heavens. That night of terror was not forgotten. The village talked about it all through the autumn and winter. But soon this was no longer done in timorous whispers. but in an everyday tone of voice, and with that satisfaction that people feel when they look back upon a disaster faced and withstood, a peril successfully overcome. The villagers now battened on details. Each had been surprised in his own way by the incredible event. Each claimed to have been the first to discover it. Some ventured to make fun of those who had been particularly shaken by it. For a long time a certain amount of excitement persisted in the village. There had been a great event. Something extraordinary had happened. Knecht did not share this mood, or feel the same gradual loss of interest in the phenomenon. For him, the whole uncanny experience remained an unforgettable warning, a thorn that continued to prick him. He could not dismiss it on the grounds that it had passed, that the danger had been averted by processions, prayers, and penances. The further it receded in time, in fact, the greater its importance became for him, because he filled it with meaning. It gave full scope to his tendency to brood and interpret. The event in itself, the whole of that miraculous natural spectacle, had been an enormously difficult problem involving many aspects. A man who had once seen it could probably spend a lifetime pondering it. Only one other person in the village would have watched the rain of stars from a kindred point of view and on the basis of similar knowledge. That was his own son and disciple, Turu. Only what this one witness would have said, to bear out or to revise his own observation, would have mattered to Knecht. But he had let this son sleep, and the longer he wondered why he had done so, why he had refrained from sharing the sight of the incredible event with the only eyewitness whose judgment he would have taken seriously, the more convinced he became that he had acted rightly, obeying a wise instinct. He had wanted to spare his family the sight, including his apprentice and associate, had wanted to spare him especially, for he loved no one so much as Turu. For that reason he had concealed the rain of falling stars from him, had defrauded him of the sight. He believed in the good spirits of sleep, especially of the sleep of youth. Moreover, if he remembered rightly, the first sight of the heavenly sign had scarcely seemed to betoken any momentary danger to the lives of the villagers. Rather, he had instantly decided that the event was an omen of future disaster, and one that concerned no one so closely as himself, the weather-maker. The calamity, when it came, would strike him alone. Something was in the offing, a threat from that realm with which his office linked him. No matter what the form in which it came, he would be the one who would chiefly bear its brunt. To keep himself alert to this danger, to oppose it resolutely when it came, to prepare his soul and accept it, but not let it intimidate or dishonor him. Such was the resolve he came to. Such was the command he thought he had received from the great omen. The danger that loomed would call for a mature and courageous man. For that reason, it would not have been well to draw his son into it, to have him as a fellow-sufferer, or even as a partner in the knowledge. For although he thought so highly of his son, he did not know whether a young and untested person would be able to cope with the menace. His son Turu, however, was most unhappy because he had slept through the great spectacle. No matter how it was interpreted, it had been a great thing in any case, and perhaps nothing of the sort would happen all the rest of his life. For quite a while he was resentful toward his father on that account. Knecht overcame the resentment by increased attentiveness and affection. He drew Turu more and more into all the duties of his office. In anticipation of things to come, he took greater pains to complete Turu's training and make him as perfect an initiate and successor as possible. Although he rarely spoke with him about the rain of stars, he admitted him with less and less restraint into his secrets, his practices, his knowledge and researches, and allowed the boy to accompany him on his walks and investigations of nature, and to join him in experiments. All this he had previously shared with no one. The winter came and passed, a damp and rather mild winter. No more stars fell, no great and unusual things happened. The village was reassured. Diligently the hunters went out looking for game. On racks beside the huts hung stiffly frozen bundles of hides, clacking against one another in windy weather. Loads of wood were dragged in from the forest on long, smoothed boards that rode lightly over the snow. It happened that just during the brief period of hard frost, an old woman died. She could not be buried at once. For some days, until the ground thawed again, the frozen corpse was laid out beside the door of her hut. The spring partly confirmed the weather-maker's forebodings. It was a dreary, joyless spring, without ardor and sap, betrayed by the moon. The moon was always tardy. The various signs that determined the day of sowing never coincided. In the forest the flowers blossomed sparsely, buds shriveled on the twigs. Knecht was deeply troubled, but did not show it. Only Ada, and especially Turu, could see how anxious he was. He not only undertook the usual incantations, but also made private sacrifices, boiling savory aromatic brews and infusions for the demons, as well as cutting his beard short on the night of the new moon, and burning it in a mixture of resin and damp bark that produced heavy smoke. He postponed as long as possible the public ceremonies, the village sacrifices, the processions, and the drum choruses. As long as possible he kept the accursed weather of this evil spring as his private concern. But eventually, when the usual time for sowing was already many days past, he had to report to the tribal mother. Sure enough, here too he encountered misfortune and trouble. The old tribal mother, who was his good friend and had rather maternal feelings for him, did not receive him. She was ill, lying in bed, and had handed over all her duties to her sister. The sister, as it happened, was distinctly cool toward the rainmaker. She did not have the older woman's austere, straightforward character, was rather fond of distractions and frivolities, and hence had taken a liking to Morrow, the drummer and mountebank, who knew how to entertain and flatter her. And Morrow was Knecht's enemy. Knecht sensed at their first conversation her coolness and dislike, although she in no way questioned his proposals. He urged that they postpone the sowing for a while longer, as well as any sacrifices or processions. She agreed to this, but she had received him icily and treated him like a subordinate. She refused his request to see the sick tribal mother, or at least to be allowed to prepare medicine for her. Knecht returned from this interview dejected, feeling poorer, and with a bad taste in his mouth. For half a moon he tried in his own way to make weather which would permit sowing. But the weather, which had so often followed the same direction as the currents within him, remained unmanageable. It mocked all his efforts. Neither spells nor sacrifices worked. The rainmaker had no choice. He had to go to the tribal mother's sister again. This time he was virtually pleading for patience, for postponement, and he realized at once that she must have spoken with that clown Morrow about him and his affairs. For in the course of the conversation on the necessity of setting the day for sowing, or else ordering ceremonies of public prayer, the old woman showed off her knowledge and used a few expressions which she could only have learned from Morrow, the former rainmaker's apprentice. Knecht asked for 3 days' grace, and then decided that the constellation was more favorable. He set the sowing for the first day of the 3rd quarter of the moon. The old woman consented and pronounced the ritual words. The decision was proclaimed to the village, and everyone prepared for the rite of sowing. But now, when everything seemed to be in hand for a while, the demons again showed their malice. On the very day of the longed-for and carefully prepared sowing, the old tribal mother died. The ritual sowing had to be postponed and her funeral prepared instead. It was celebrated with great solemnity. Behind the new village mother, with her sisters and daughters, the rainmaker took his place in the robes reserved for great processions, wearing his tall, pointed fox-fur headdress. He was assisted by his son Turu, who struck the two-toned hardwood clappers together. Great honors were shown to the deceased and to her sister, the new tribal mother. Morrow, leading the drummers, kept in the forefront of the mourners and won much attention and applause. The village wept and celebrated, lamented and feasted, enjoyed the drum music and the sacrifices. It was a fine day for all, but the sowing had again been put off. Knecht stood through it all with dignity and composure, but he was profoundly saddened. It seemed to him that along with the tribal mother, he was burying all the good days of his life. Soon afterward, at the request of the new tribal mother, the sowing was likewise celebrated with special magnificence. Solemnly the procession marched around the fields. Solemnly the old woman scattered the first handfuls of seed on the common land. To either side of her walked her sisters, each carrying a pouch of grain into which the eldest dipped her hand. Knecht breathed a little easier when this ceremony was finally completed. But the seed sowed so festively was destined to bring no joy and no harvest. It was a merciless year. Beginning with a relapse into wintry frosts, the weather indulged in every imaginable caprice and spite that spring. In summer, when meager crops at last covered the fields thinly, half as tall as they should have been, the last blow of all came, an incredible drought, the worst anyone could remember. Week after week the sun blazed in a white haze of heat. The smaller brooks dried up. Only a muddy marsh remained of the village pond, a paradise for dragonflies and a monstrous brood of mosquitoes. Deep cracks gaped in the parched earth. The villagers could see the crops withering. Now and then clouds gathered, but the lightning storms remained dry. If a brief shower fell, it was followed by days of a parching east wind. Lightning often struck tall trees, setting fire to their withered tops.
"Turu," Knecht said to his son one day, "this will not turn out well. We have all the demons against us. It began with the falling stars. I think it is going to cost me my life. Remember this. If I must be sacrificed, assume my office at once and insist that my body be burned and my ashes strewn on the fields. You will suffer great hunger through the winter, but the evil spells will be broken. You must see to it that no one touches the community's seed grain under penalty of death. Next year will be better, and people will say, 'Good that we have the new young weather-maker.'" There was despair in the village. Morrow incited the people. Frequently threats and curses were shouted at the rainmaker. Ada fell sick and lay shaken by vomiting and fever. The processions, the sacrifices, the long heart-throbbing drum choruses were useless. Knecht led them, for that was his duty, but when the people scattered again, he stood alone, shunned by all. He knew what was necessary, and he knew also that Morrow had already besieged the tribal mother with demands that he be sacrificed. For his own honor and his son's sake, he took the last step himself. He dressed Turu in the ceremonial robes, went to the tribal mother with him, and proposed him as his successor, at the same time offering himself as a sacrifice. She looked at him for a short while with a curious, searching glance. Then she nodded and assented. The sacrifice was carried out that same day. The whole village would have attended, but many lay sick with dysentery. Ada, too, was gravely ill. Turu, in his robes, with the tall fox-fur headdress, all but collapsed from heat-stroke. All the dignitaries and leaders of the village who were not ill joined in the procession, including the tribal mother with two of her oldest sisters, and Morrow, the chief of the drum corps. Behind them followed the mass of the villagers. No one insulted the old rainmaker. The procession was silent and dejected. They marched to the woods and sought out a large circular clearing that Knecht himself had appointed as the site of the sacrifice. Most of the men had their stone axes with them to cut wood for the funeral pyre. When they reached the clearing, they placed the rainmaker in the center
and the dignitaries of the village formed a small ring around him, with the rest of the crowd in a larger circle on the outside. There was an indecisive, embarrassed silence until the rainmaker himself spoke. "I was your rainmaker," he said. "I did my work as well as I could for many years. Now the demons are against me. Nothing I do succeeds. Therefore I have offered myself for a sacrifice. That will placate the demons. My son Turu will be your new rainmaker. Now kill me, and when I am dead, do exactly as my son says. Farewell. And now, who will be my executioner? I recommend the drummer Morrow. He is surely the right man for the task." He fell silent. No one stirred. Turu, flushed deeply under the heavy fur headdress, gave a tormented look around the circle. His father's mouth twisted mockingly. At last the tribal mother stamped her foot furiously, beckoned to Morrow, and shouted at him, "Go ahead! Take the axe and do it!" Morrow, axe clutched in his hands, posted himself before his former teacher. He hated him more than ever. The lines of scorn around those silent old lips irked him bitterly. He raised the axe and swung it over his head. Taking aim, he held it aloft, staring into the victim's face, waiting for him to close his eyes. But Knecht did not. He kept his eyes wide open, fixed steadily on the man with the axe. They were almost expressionless, but what expression there was hovered between pity and scorn. In fury, Morrow flung the axe away. "I won't do it," he murmured, and pressing through the circle of dignitaries, he lost himself in the crowd. Several villagers laughed softly. The tribal mother had turned pale with rage, as much at Morrow's uselessness and cowardice as at the arrogance of the rainmaker. She beckoned to one of the oldest men, a quiet, dignified person who stood leaning on his axe and seemed to be ashamed of this whole unseemly scene. He stepped forward and gave the victim a brief, friendly nod. They had known each other since boyhood, and now the victim willingly closed his eyes. Knecht closed them tightly and bowed his head a little. The old man struck with the axe. Knecht fell. Turu, the new rainmaker, could not say a word. He gave the necessary orders with gestures alone. Soon the pyre was heaped up and the body laid on it. The solemn ritual of making fire with 2 consecrated sticks was Turu's first official act. Chapter 2. The Father Confessor. In the days when St. Hilarion was still alive, although far advanced in years, there lived in the city of Gaza a man named Josephus Famulus, who until his 30th year or longer had led a worldly life and studied the books of the pagans. Then, through a woman whom he was pursuing, he had been instructed in the divine doctrine and the sweetness of the Christian virtues, had submitted to holy baptism, renounced his sins, and sat for several years at the feet of the presbyters of his city. In particular, he listened with burning curiosity to the popular tales of the life of pious hermits in the desert, until one day, at the age of 36, he set out on the path already taken by St. Paul and St. Anthony, and which so many devout souls have taken since. He gave his goods to the elders, to be distributed to the poor of the community, bade farewell to his friends at the city gate, and wandered out into the desert, out of this vile world, to take up the life of the penitent. For many years the sun seared and parched him. He scraped his knees on rock and sand as he prayed. He waited, fasting, for the sun to set, before he chewed his few dates. Devils tormented him with temptations, mockery, and trials, but he struck them down with prayer, with penitence, with renunciation of self, in the ways we may find described in the lives of the Blessed Fathers. Through many sleepless nights he gazed at the stars, and even the stars provided temptations and confusions for him. He scanned the constellations, for he had learned to read in them stories of the gods and symbols of human nature. The presbyters held this science in abomination, but he was still engrossed by fantasies and ideas he had entertained in his pagan days. In those times, eremites lived wherever the barren wilderness was broken by a spring, a patch of vegetation, a large or small oasis. Some dwelt entirely alone, some in small brotherhoods, as they are pictured in a painting in the Campo Santo of Pisa, practicing poverty and love of neighbor. They became adepts of a languishing ars moriendi, the art of dying, mortification of the ego and dying to the world, passing through death to him, the Redeemer, to the inalienable reward. They were attended by angels and devils. They wrote hymns, expelled demons, healed and blessed, and seemed to have assumed the duty of making up for the pleasure-seeking, brutality, and sensuality of many past and future ages by engendering a mighty surge of enthusiasm and devotion, an ecstatic excess of renunciation. Many of them probably were acquainted with ancient pagan practices of purification, methods and exercises of spiritualization elaborated in Asia for centuries. But nothing was said of such matters. These methods and yoga exercises were no longer taught. They lay under the ban that Christianity more and more sternly imposed upon everything pagan. In some of these penitents, the fervor of their life developed special gifts, gifts of prayer, of healing by laying on of hands, of prophecy, of exorcism, gifts of judging and punishing, comforting and blessing. In Josephus, too, a gift slumbered, and with the passing years, as his hair began to gray, it slowly came to flower. It was the gift of listening. Whenever a brother from one of the hermitages, or a child of the world, harried and troubled of soul, came to Joseph and told him of his deeds, sufferings, temptations, and missteps, related the story of his life, his struggle for goodness and his failures in the struggle, or spoke of loss, pain, or sorrow, Joseph knew how to listen to him, to open his ears and his heart, to gather the man's sufferings and anxieties into himself and hold them, so that the penitent was sent away emptied and calmed. Slowly, over long years, this function had taken possession of him and made an instrument of him, an ear that people trusted. His virtues were patience, a receptive passivity, and great discretion. More and more frequently people came to him to pour out their hearts, to relieve their pent-up distress, but many of them, even though they had come a long way to his reed hut, would find they lacked the courage to confess. They would writhe in shame, be coy about their sins, sigh heavily, and remain silent for hours. But he behaved in the same way toward all, whether they spoke freely or reluctantly, fluently or hesitantly, whether they hurled out their secrets in a fury or basked in self-importance because of them. He regarded every man in the same way, whether he accused God or himself, whether he magnified or minimized his sins and sufferings, whether he confessed a killing or merely an act of lewdness, whether he lamented an unfaithful sweetheart or the loss of his soul's salvation. It did not alarm Josephus when someone told of converse with demons and seemed to be on the friendliest terms with the devil. He did not lose patience when someone talked at great length while obviously concealing the main issue. Nor was he stern when someone charged himself with delusory and invented sins. All the complaints, confessions, charges, and qualms of conscience that were brought to him seemed to pour into his ears like water into the desert sands. He seemed to pass no judgment upon them, and to feel neither pity nor contempt for the person confessing. Nevertheless, or perhaps for that very reason, whatever was confessed to him seemed not to be spoken into the void, but to be transformed, alleviated, and redeemed in the telling and being heard. Only rarely did he reply with a warning or admonition. Even more rarely did he give advice, let alone any order. Such did not seem to be his function, and his callers apparently sensed that it was not. His function was to arouse confidence and to be receptive, to listen patiently and lovingly, helping the imperfectly formed confession to take shape, inviting all that was dammed up or encrusted within each soul to flow and pour out. When it did, he received it and wrapped it in silence. His response was always the same. At the end of every confession, the terrible ones and the innocuous ones, the contrite ones and the vain ones, he would tell the penitent to kneel beside him and recite the Lord's Prayer. Then he would dismiss him, kissing him on the brow. Imposing penances and punishments was not his business, nor did he even feel empowered to pronounce a proper priestly absolution. Neither judging nor forgiving sin was his affair. By listening and understanding, he seemed to take upon himself a share of the transgression. He seemed to help to bear it. By remaining silent, he seemed to bury what he had heard and consign it to the past. By praying with the penitent after the confession, he seemed to receive him as his brother and acknowledge him as his fellow. By kissing him, he seemed to bless him in a more brotherly than priestly, a more affectionate than ceremonial manner. His reputation spread through the whole neighborhood of Gaza and beyond. Sometimes he was even mentioned in the same breath as the great hermit and father-confessor Dion Pugil. The latter's fame, however, was already some 10 years older, and was founded on quite different abilities. For Father Dion was celebrated for being able to read the souls of those who sought him out without recourse to words. He often surprised a faltering penitent by charging him bluntly with his still unconfessed sins. Joseph had heard 100 amazing stories about his acuity, and would never have ventured to compare himself with him. Father Dion was also a wise counselor of erring souls, a great judge, chastiser, and rectifier. He assigned penances, castigations, and pilgrimages, ordered marriages, compelled enemies to make up, and enjoyed the authority of a bishop. Although he lived in the vicinity of Ascalon, people came to him from as far away as Jerusalem, and places even more remote. Like most eremites and penitents, Josephus Famulus had lived through long years of passionate and exhausting struggle. Although he had abandoned his life in the world, had given away his house and possessions, and left the city with its manifold invitations to the pleasures of the senses, he was still saddled with his old self. Within his body and soul were all those instincts which can lead a man into distress and temptation. At first he had struggled primarily against his body. He had been stern and harsh with it, subjecting it to hunger and thirst, to scars and calluses, until it had gradually withered. But even in its gaunt, ascetic shell, the old Adam could shamefully catch him by surprise and vex him with foolish cravings and desires, dreams and hallucinations. We know well that the devil lays special siege to penitents and fugitives from this world. When, therefore, people seeking consolation and confession occasionally visited him, he gratefully acknowledged their coming as a sign of grace and a consolation to him in his ascetic's life. For he had been given a meaning beyond himself. A task had been conferred upon him. He could serve others, or serve God as an instrument for drawing souls to him. That had been a wonderful and elevating feeling. But in the course of time, he had learned that even the goods of the soul belong to the earthly realm and can become temptations and snares. For often, when such a traveler arrived, either on foot or riding, stopped at his cave for a drink of water and asked the hermit to hear his confession, a feeling of satisfaction and pleasure would creep over our Joseph. He felt well pleased with himself. As soon as he recognized this vanity and self-love, he was profoundly alarmed. Often he knelt to beg God's forgiveness, and asked that no more penitents be sent to him in his unworthiness, neither from the huts of the ascetic brethren in the vicinity, nor from the villages and towns of the world. But when for a while no one came to confess, he found himself not much better off. And on the other hand, when the stream of penitence resumed, he caught himself sinning once more. After a time, listening to some confessions, he found himself subject to spasms of coldness and lovelessness, even to contempt for the penitents. With a sigh, he accepted these struggles too, and there were periods during which he inflicted solitary humiliations and penances upon himself after each confession. Moreover, he made it a rule to treat all penitents not only as brothers, but also with a kind of special deference. The less he liked the person, the more respectfully he behaved toward him, for he regarded each one as a messenger from God, sent to test him. Belatedly, after many years, when he was already approaching old age, he arrived at a certain equanimity. To those who lived in the vicinity, he seemed to be a man without faults, who had found his peace in God. But peace, too, is a living thing, and like all life, it must wax and wane, accommodate, withstand trials, and undergo changes. Such was the case with the peace Josephus Famulus enjoyed. It was unstable, visible one moment, gone the next, sometimes near as a candle carried in the hand, sometimes as remote as a star in the wintry sky. And in time, a new and special kind of sin and temptation more and more often made life difficult for him. It was not a strong, passionate emotion such as indignation or a sudden rush of instinctual urges. Rather, it seemed to be the opposite. It was a feeling very easy to bear in its initial stages, for it was scarcely perceptible, a condition without any real pain or deprivation, a slack, lukewarm, tedious state of the soul which could only be described in negative terms as a vanishing, a waning, and finally a complete absence of joy. There are days when the sun does not shine and the rain does not pour, but the sky sinks quietly into itself, wraps itself up, is gray but not black, sultry but not with the tension of an imminent thunderstorm. Gradually, Joseph's days became like this as he approached old age. Less and less could he distinguish the mornings from the evenings, feast days from ordinary days, hours of rapture from hours of dejection. Everything ran sluggishly along in limp tedium and joylessness. "This is old age," he thought sadly. He was sad because he had expected aging and the gradual extinction of his passions to bring a brightening and easing of his life, to take him a step nearer to harmony and mature peace of soul. And now age seemed to be disappointing and cheating him by offering nothing but this weary, gray, joyless emptiness, this feeling of chronic satiation. Above all, he felt sated, by sheer existence, by breathing, by sleep at night, by life in his cave on the edge of the little oasis, by the eternal round of evenings and mornings, by the passing of travelers and pilgrims, camel riders and donkey riders, and most of all by the people who came to visit him, by those foolish, anxious, and childishly credulous people who had this craving to tell him about their lives, their sins and their fears, their temptations and self-accusations. Sometimes it all seemed to him like the small spring of water that collected in its stone basin in the oasis, flowed through grass for a while, forming a small brook, and then flowed on out into the desert sands, where, after a brief course, it dried up and vanished. Similarly, all these confessions, these inventories of sins, these lives, these torments of conscience, big and small, serious and vain, all of them came pouring into his ear by the dozens, by the hundreds, more and more of them. But his ear was not dead like the desert sands. His ear was alive and could not drink, swallow, and absorb forever. It felt fatigued, abused, glutted. It longed for the flow and splashing of words, confessions, anxieties, charges, self-condemnations, to cease. It longed for peace, death, and stillness to take the place of this endless flow. That was it. He wished for the end. He was tired, had had enough and more than enough. His life had become stale and worthless. Things went so far with him that at times he felt tempted to put an end to it, to punish and extinguish himself, as the traitor Judas had done when he hanged himself. Just as the devil had plagued him in the earlier stages of his ascetic's life by smuggling into his soul the desires, notions, and dreams of sensual and worldly pleasures, so the evil one now assailed him with ideas of self-destruction, so that he found himself considering every tree with the view to its holding a noose, every cliff in the vicinity with a view to casting himself from its top. He resisted the temptation. He fought. He did not yield. But day and night he lived in a fire of self-hatred and craving for death. Life had become unbearable and hateful. To such a pass had Joseph come. One day, when he was again standing on one of the cliffs, he saw in the distance between earth and sky 2 or 3 tiny figures. Obviously they were travelers, perhaps pilgrims, perhaps visitors who intended to call on him for the usual reason. And suddenly he was seized by an irresistible craving to leave as fast as possible, to get away from this place at once, to escape from this life. The craving that seized him was so overpowering, so instinctive, that it swept away all the thoughts, objections, and scruples that naturally came to him. For how could a pious penitent have obeyed an impulse without twinges of conscience? But he was already running. He sped back to the cave where he had dwelt through so many years of struggle, where he had experienced so many exaltations and defeats. In reckless haste he gathered up a few handfuls of dates and a gourd of water, stuffed them into his old traveling pouch, slung it over his shoulder, took up his staff, and left the green peace of his little home, a fugitive and restless roamer, fleeing away from God and man, and most of all fleeing from what he had formerly thought the best he had to offer, his function and his mission. At first he tore on frantically, as if those figures in the distance whom he had seen from the cliff were enemies who would pursue him. But after an hour of tramping, his anxious haste ebbed away. Movement tired him pleasantly, and he stopped to rest, although he did not allow himself to eat. It had become a sacred habit for him to take no food before sunset. While he rested, his reason, skilled in self-examination, once more asserted itself. It looked into his instinctive action, seeking to form a judgment, and it did not disapprove, wild though the action might seem, but rather viewed it with benevolence. His reason decided that for the first time in a long while he was doing something harmless and innocent. This was flight, a sudden and rash flight, granted, but not a shameful one. He had abandoned a post which he was no longer fit for. By running away, he had admitted his failure to himself and to him who might be observing him. He had given up a daily, repeated, useless struggle and confessed himself beaten. There was nothing grand, heroic, and saintly about that, his reason decided, but it was sincere, and seemed to have been inescapable. Now he found himself wondering that he had attempted this flight so late, that he had held on for so long. It now seemed to him that the doggedness with which he had for so long defended a lost position had been a mistake, or rather that it had been prompted by his egotism, his old Adam. Now he thought he understood why this obstinacy had led to such evil, to such diabolic consequences, to such division and lethargy in his soul, and even to demonic possession. For what else could he call his urge toward death and self-destruction? Certainly a Christian ought to be no enemy of death. Certainly a penitent and saint ought to regard his life as an offering. But the thought of suicide was utterly diabolic, and could arise only in a soul no longer ruled and guarded by God's angels, but by evil demons.